Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Now, settle in and journey back to the Old West, where love, courage, and second chances are waiting to be found. Copyright Indiana Wake. To Love from Afar by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. I see them, Elsie Meadows pointed off into the distance. Do you see? Just hovering around that rocky outcrop. Oh yes, Jane Meadows laughed. We're coming for you, girls, she called out amusingly to the escaped cattle not too far ahead of them. The sisters rode side by side and at a leisurely pace. They weren't worried about the renegades. It was all in a day's work at the Wild Meadow Ranch. 2 years had passed since their beloved father had passed, and they had been catapulted into their new lives as ranch women. In that time, they had become proficient. More than proficient, they were skilled beyond their wildest imaginings, and they enjoyed the life despite it being hard work. Jane had been the one who came up with the idea of the sisters helping out on the spread, when Wild Meadow Ranch was failing. As things got worse, they had been within the evil grasp of Dale Clayton, the man who was buying up all of Grayton Crest, whether people wanted him to or not. And the man was doing it at the lowest price possible, with many a dirty trick involved. Being a ranch hand was not what Jane had expected for herself. At the time, the entire family had been desperate, not least Jane. Being the eldest child, she had felt a flush of pride to help save the place. She had come up with the idea of herself and her younger sister becoming ranch hands to help out Garth Martin. He had been their father's dearest friend, and he had worked himself inside out trying to keep the Meadows family afloat after the tragedy of Cal Meadows' early passing. Of course, Garth had gone on to marry their mother, Charlotte, a most welcome happening as far as the Meadows brood were concerned. But there had been a time when Jane Meadows had sat prettily on a horse, despite being a natural horsewoman. She had perched demurely and ridden sedately, mostly down into the town of Grafton Crest to the barn dance or to see her friend, Eileen Thornton. That was a far cry from the woman she was now. Leaping into the saddle with vigor and ease while wearing the thick work trousers she routinely wore for her day-to-day occupation. They were teamed with a plaid shirt and a broad-brimmed hat. Now, she tore about the place with the confidence of a seasoned cowboy, as did her sister, Elsie. There was little left of the demure and the sedate about Jane. They can see us, Jane, Elsie chuckled, and they're not even bothering to hide. They're like little children who know they've been naughty. They were nearing the little group of escapees, all of whom continued to munch at the short, sweet grass without a hint of concern. I don't think they'll put up a fight. Jane drew her horse to a halt and lightly jumped down. Giving them a little longer, huh? Elsie said, jumping down from her horse also. I thought we could stop here and eat our lunch. It's a nice spot and there's a fine breeze coming up from the river. Sounds good to me. Elsie reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the food parcel their mother had prepared for them. There's a lot here, she went on as she opened the packet. You don't think this is Garth's too? No, Ma packed him up a separate meal. I saw her hand it to him, Jane said as she settled down on the grass just a few feet from the grazing cattle. Ma sure does like to feed us up. I'll be bursting out of these pants if she doesn't soon stop, Elsie said in a flat tone, something which always made her sister laugh. Elsie was the quietest of all the Meadows offspring and always had been. But when her father had died, it almost took her voice away entirely. Jane had worried that her younger sister would never recover. But the ranch itself had been the one thing to bring Elsie back to them. As always, it was a joy to hear her amusing phrases delivered in such a matter-of-fact way. Jane had never known anybody like her sister for that way of being. You could leave some of it, Jane said helpfully. When it's right here on my lap. No, I don't think so, she said and took a huge bite of the freshly baked bread. I don't think you need to worry, anyway, you've always stayed the same size. I guess we work hard, and we need the food. Jane looked down at herself. Had she stayed the same? You look the same too, Elsie said through a mouthful of bread as though reading her sister's thoughts. Thank you. I saw Ma in Grafton Crest yesterday when I went down to collect our mail from the mail office, Elsie went on. Ma could have saved you the trip if you'd known. I doubt it, she was in the diner. All that cooking for us probably gave her an appetite. Jane laughed. No, she was just drinking coffee and talking up a blue streak with Eileen. Eileen Thornton? Who else? Eileen is the only Eileen I know who works in the diner. Very smart, Elsie. Jane chuckled. Well, it was Monday and Eileen's always looking for someone to make the slowest day of the week move along a little faster. I used to love going down to the diner on Mondays to spend the day with her. She used to get about one customer every hour. That all seemed like a long time ago now, back in the days when a carefree young Jane, just 18 years old, had spent her time laughing and talking. Her biggest concern being what to wear at the barn dance on Saturday nights. How much she had changed. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been to the barn dance, certainly not since their father had died. Well, Ma was sure enjoying it too. I reckon they were probably talking about you, Elsie said mischievously. I have no doubt, Jane said with a sigh. Probably putting their heads together again to find some way of launching me back into the Grafton Crest life once again. You make it sound like a bad thing. It's not bad, it's just not for me anymore. Why not? I guess I just don't think I fit into my old life anymore. Is there any harm in giving it a try? After all, it was your life, wasn't it? How hard can it be to live it like you used to? In my old life, I wasn't head ranch hand at Wild Meadow. And you're not now. Elsie scowled, making Jane hoot with laughter. Sorry, joint head ranch hand. Correct. Elsie grinned. I guess I remember a time when my dresses were new and not thin and faded. My nails were longer, and my hands were soft. Oh yes, and my face wasn't so tanned and freckled. So what? Elsie said and looked serious. Elsie had been just 16 when the sisters had taken on such great responsibilities. She hadn't known what it was to spend her time thinking about marriage proposals and pretty dresses. Elsie hadn't seen such changes in herself and her way of living as Jane had. Or perhaps they were just very different people. I would feel out of place, Elsie. Well, you wouldn't have to wear what you're wearing now. You have that real nice dress you wear for church. But I always wear it for church. The whole town sees me in it every Sunday. Does that matter? Elsie looked genuinely perplexed and Jane just loved her all the more for it. I wish I had a little of what you've got, Elsie. A little of that shoulder-shrugging spirit. Help yourself, Elsie said, and shrugged expansively for Jane's amusement. Thank you. And anyway, it's only a barn dance. Just go. You never know, back out there in the thick of it with Eileen, you might find you enjoy yourself. What barn dance? Jane asked suspiciously. Oh, the barn dance on Saturday night, Elsie said flatly. This Saturday night? Yep. Elsie took another bite of bread. Why do I get the feeling that you know exactly what Ma and Eileen were talking about in the diner? Jane reached out to pull her sister's long braid, only Elsie ducked expertly out of the way. "Oh, didn't I say?" I wandered in to join them. Elsie looked rueful. "No, you did not say." "Well, I'm saying now," Elsie said and swallowed the bread. "Eileen is coming over on Saturday afternoon and she and Ma are going to convince you to go out and enjoy yourself that night." "That's the plan." "Well, looks like you've given the secret away. I suppose it will give you a chance to agonize over what dress to wear." Elsie chuckled. "Oh, you mean to try to find one out of the 4 dresses which doesn't look old-fashioned and worn out?" "Exactly." Elsie gave her customary shrug. "Oh, come on. If you go out and enjoy yourself, I'll help you make a new dress for the next time. What do you say?" "I say it sounds like I don't have much of a choice. Very much like our girls here." Elsie was getting to her feet. "Come on, let's get them back down onto the ranch." "Now I know how they feel," Jane said, laughing as she wondered if she really could enjoy the barn dance as she used to. Chapter 2. By the time Eileen arrived on the Saturday afternoon, Jane had reconciled herself to the idea that she would be going to the town barn dance. All week, she had stared at her dresses over and over again, finally deciding on a faded cotton dress in cornflower blue. If nothing else, the color matched her eyes and looked good against her golden hair. "You will come?" "If I'd known it was going to be so easy, I would have asked you months ago," Eileen said, clearly surprised that her friend had capitulated so easily. "I was already prepared for it by my sister," Jane said ruefully. "Honestly?" Jane's mother said and laughed. "I'd have thought Elsie could have kept a secret. You really had no need to sneak up on me with it, Ma." "And she didn't exactly. I guessed. With a little prompting from your sister. We thought it would be the best way of getting you to agree to it. You've stayed home so long I didn't think you'd want to go." Eileen was smiling broadly, her pretty face lit up with excitement. It suddenly seemed too long since Eileen had been a regular feature in Jane's life. It was nobody's fault, just the grind of necessary hard work and the sudden responsibility of the ranch. But Eileen had never forgotten her, calling in whenever she could have a few minutes with her old friend, and always seeking her out after church on a Sunday. Jane knew that Eileen was the best friend she could have, for only a best friend could hold on to that friendship in the hard times as well as the good. Only a best friend would see only the friendship and perceive no neglect. "So, are you going to get ready?" Eileen asked with an urgency which suggested she didn't want to give Jane too much time to think about it. "Yes, but I warn you, my dress is far from new," Jane said, and suddenly felt the old misgivings trying to crowd out her determination to simply enjoy things. "Mine either," Eileen said with a grin. Jane smiled and wandered away to her room to put on the cornflower blue dress which she had pulled out of the closet and stared at on and off for some days. When she pulled the dress out of the closet again, she wondered if she had made the right choice after all. It was the least worn-looking of the few she owned, but there was no interest to it. It was just a plain blue fabric, no pattern, no embroidery. The sleeves were short and the neckline set at a very sensible height. Its saving grace, she supposed, was that her petticoats were still white and looked nice peeping out at the hem. Jane slid into the dress, realizing that it didn't fit quite as well as it used to. Despite all the extra food, her body had become a little lean with all the physical work. She wasn't thin, she just didn't feel she had as much shape as she once had. When had this all happened? When had her hands become rough and her dresses old and unflattering? Jane knew that lack of funds could no longer be cited as a reason. The family was certainly making enough money now to buy fabric for new dresses. But the will to spend her free time measuring, cutting, and sewing had deserted her, and it had taken a little of her old feminine pride with it. The truth was that she was proud of her achievements on the ranch and less so of the changes those achievements had made to her. With her dress on, she set about her hair. Jane knew she had time, for Eileen, who had clearly expected to have a fight on her hands, had turned up at the ranch house very early. Jane could hear her laughing and chattering with her ma and smiled. Eileen could strike up a conversation with anybody on earth, she was sure of it. Sitting down at her old and well-worn dressing table, Jane set about brushing her thick golden locks to a shine. Although it had been a little lightened by the sun, her hair was still her crowning glory, and she hoped it would take the edge off the rest of her appearance. It gleamed brighter with every stroke, and she smiled at her reflection. She wanted to go easy on herself but was struggling. Could she really not have held on to just a little of her old life these last 2 years? Had it really been so necessary to forget all her old ways, the frivolities which had made her Jane Meadows, in order to succeed at the ranch? Probably not, but she wondered if it was at all conscious. It certainly wasn't a choice she remembered making, at any rate. As she turned her hair into a full and soft-looking bun at the back of her head, Jane felt a little frisson of her old self. She pinned her hair nicely and arranged thick wisps to frame her face with ease. Some things you never forgot, obviously. Her hair looked so good that she forgot a little of her foreboding about the dress. Surely, she wouldn't be the only woman in the town barn wearing a dress which had seen better days. At least that was the hope. She took her small black ankle boots out of the bottom of the closet and put them on. They had been nearly new when her father had died, and she had worn them so infrequently since then that they had remained that way. If all else failed, she would have to do a high kick or two so she could show off the fine form of her footwear. Finally, she looked at her hands. Jane winced as she thoroughly studied the parched skin front and back, not to mention the fact that every fingernail was a vastly different length when compared to its nearest neighbor. By the time she had finished filing them to similar lengths, they looked rather short. Splaying her fingers out in front of her, Jane thought they looked altogether stubby now. Somehow, it was the final straw. She knew it was ridiculous as final straws went, but there it was. Tears slid from her blue eyes and rolled down her tan cheeks, and she knew she wasn't ready for this. She needed time to prepare, to return somewhat to her old self. She didn't want the people she had once spent so much social time with to witness the changes. Moreover, she didn't want to see them witnessing those changes, to see them pitying her. "Hey," Eileen said, having tapped lightly on the door as she popped her head into the room. "How are you getting on in here?" Her grin immediately became a frown of concern. "Oh, honey, what is it?" she went on in a soothing voice as she darted across the room. "I can't do this. Jane, you have to start somewhere." Despite the direction, Eileen's tone was gentle and loving. "Just look at me. I am looking at you. You look beautiful, just like you always have done." "Oh, Eileen, you're just the sweetest person in my life," Jane began and sniffed. "But I don't feel like myself anymore. I can honestly say I feel terrified by the thought of walking into the barn and having the whole town look at me. But most of them see you in church every Sunday." "I know. In my Sunday dress. But this is different. I feel wrong. You know, if you don't at least give it a try, you'll always feel wrong. Who knows? Maybe you'll still feel wrong after tonight, but at least you'll know." Eileen crouched down on her haunches and rested her hands on Jane's knees. "You know what? I'd give my eyeballs for your hair. Even just a few handfuls of it, she said and ran her hands through her own brown curls. "Oh, Eileen," Jane said and started to laugh. "Only you can make me laugh when I'm in the middle of crying." "I have a motive of my own," Eileen said softly. "You see, I have missed you so much, Janie. I've missed you so much I don't even know how to put it into words. Now, I know things have changed, and I know just how much you've suffered these last years, but please come back to me, if only for a little while. I want us to stand in the barn with a cold drink and chatter like we always did. I want us to laugh and joke and be the two silly girls we once were. Nothing's the same without my friend, honey. Nothing." Eileen's own eyes shone with emotion and Jane leaned forward and threw her arms around her neck, holding her tightly. "Of course, I'll come to the dance, Eileen. And I've missed you too, so much." Even though she said the words, and meant them, Jane was afraid to go to the dance. It was no longer part of her comfort zone, and even though she knew it was silly, she feared what might happen there. Chapter 3. Walking into the town barn was a strange experience for Jane. It felt familiar and alien all at once. In one moment, she felt as if she had never been away. There was a smell to the barn, the familiar scent of warm hay bales and warm bodies. The music seemed hardly to have changed, perhaps even the fiddlers were the same men, she could not say. She closed her eyes and the sound was as familiar to her as her own breathing, feet on the wooden floor, whoops, strains of the fiddles, young women greeting one another loudly. It was any other Saturday night in the Grafton Crest town barn. But then Jane opened her eyes again and really looked around her. Even though she recognized so many of the people, it did not seem that they had stood still in the same way that the smells and sounds of the barn had. There were women she recognized, girls she had been in the schoolroom with, not only with their husbands, but one or two of them with the early signs of being with child. She had no doubt that there were plenty more who had come out to enjoy the evening, leaving a child or two at home with a grandparent for safekeeping. It suddenly felt as if she had got nowhere in her life. She felt faintly ridiculous, a child rather than an adult. And even though her beloved Eileen, at her side as always, was not a married woman, Eileen already had a date for when that would change. She peered at Eileen, who was waving an enthusiastic and far-reaching greeting to the man in question, Barney Brown. They had both known Barney for years and Jane thought she had always known, somehow, that Eileen and Barney would one day be married. They were each blessed with a teasing, merry nature, and there was never a dull moment when those two were around. They had been courting for years now, comfortable enough with each other that they could wait to be married. Barney was a farm laborer who worked long hours, saving every penny he earned so that he might buy his own plot of land one day and build a house there. And Eileen, so many years of serving coffee and pie in the diner, was gently saving for that same end. Both were determined that they would run their own little farm when the time was right. They knew they loved one another. It was not something which needed to be said every day so that each might reassure the other. They did not have to rush down the aisle to be sure of holding their affection and loyalty. There was plenty of time for Eileen and Barney, and that was both reassuring and frightening. Where was Jane's Barney? Pushing her worries aside, Jane thought about her friends with warmth. All their waiting had paid off. They had saved a tidy nest egg between them, enough for a small wedding celebration with the rest to be laid out on a small farming plot and enough timber to build a little home. Not for Eileen the early babies that other young women went in for. She and Barney had a plan, and they had been real patient about it all. But even that made Jane feel different. Eileen might not already be married with a small brood of children, but she was already some years into the plan for how her life would be. It made Jane feel as if she was nowhere, just floating along without a life of her own. Jane was just a rancher and that was all. She felt as if she hardly had a name anymore as she stood there looking at so many people who had moved on and left her behind. "Looks like Barney is set on talking all night," Eileen said with a dramatic sigh. "He never was one for dancing, and with good reason." Jane laughed and hoped she would be able to dispel the feeling of not belonging. "Ain't that the truth?" Eileen grinned as she looked over at Barney, deep in conversation with a man Jane could only see the back of. "But he makes me laugh whenever he gives it a go." "You two were always going to be together, Eileen. I knew it way back when we were in the schoolroom. You just seemed to fit nice and I could never have imagined either one of you with anybody else." "I reckon I felt just the same way, even though I always used to pretend that Barney got on my nerves." "You still pretend he gets on your nerves?" "Only because he likes it." Eileen laughed again as she took Jane's hand and began to lead her towards the refreshments. When they reached the head of the line waiting for fruit punch, Jane found that she had lost her tongue somewhat and simply stared a little blankly at the young woman serving up the drinks. Eileen quickly took over, getting them each a plain fruit punch without liquor and hurrying her friend away to take a seat on one of the vacant hay bales. "What's troubling you, honey?" Eileen asked the moment they had settled down and each taken a sip of their drink. "Nothing, really. I guess I was just thinking about school and all the fun we used to have and how much I miss it. How I used to tease you about Barney and the way we used to laugh all day long," Jane said, knowing there was more to it than that but not yet ready to talk about it. "I miss that too, but we're both still here, aren't we? We're both still living and breathing and you're still teasing me about Barney even though I'm set to marry the man." "I know, we really are both still living and breathing." "I understand," Eileen said. "There's more to it than that, Jane. There's more to life than just living and breathing and I think it's time for you to start to live again. I've been talking to your ma, I know. Eileen held a hand out in front of her as Jane rolled her eyes and shook her head. "I've been talking to your ma, and she tells me that things are looking up at Wild Meadow. Jane, you've done your bit. You got things up and running again when it looked as if the worst was going to happen. It's all right for you to take your hands off the reins for a few minutes, maybe even an hour, just long enough to enjoy yourself. It's not like you can herd cattle in the middle of the night, is it? It's not so much that, Eileen. To be honest, I've known for a long time that we're winning again, we're making it work. I know I can take a little time off now and be confident that the whole thing isn't going to fall apart. I mean, I felt scared for a long time, a real long time. I didn't even dare think about anything other than the Wild Meadow Ranch because I thought it would somehow crumble to dust while I wasn't looking, you know? I know, you didn't dare risk taking your attention away from it for just a minute and that is completely understandable. You'd already lost so much, losing your daddy and all, and the threat of losing Wild Meadow and the ranch house must have been appalling. I tell you, I tried over and over again to put myself in your shoes and honestly, Jane, I couldn't. It was too painful for me to imagine just how much you were suffering. Eileen looked down into her drink as if a little ashamed of the admission. It's more than enough for me that you even tried to imagine it, Eileen. There's no real benefit though, you know. I know you understand, and you've never turned your back on me, even in those first months when I was so single-minded about everything and hardly ever laid eyes on you. Jane laid a comforting hand on Eileen's knee. So, if you're not worrying about the ranch at this very moment in time, what's eating you? You're not right, Jane, I can see it. I guess I feel like I don't belong here. Of course you belong, Eileen looked surprised. It's not anything about this place, nor the people in it. Nobody is making me feel that way, I just feel it. Everybody has moved on, everybody has a plan for their lives. Look at me, I haven't moved an inch since leaving school, have I? No husband, no plans, not even a decent dress to wear to the dance. You look lovely. Eileen turned big sad eyes upon her friend. And it's not that I can't afford the fabric for a new dress now, it's just that I guess I forgot I ever cared. It's like I haven't put that sort of effort into myself and my own life for a long time, and now I just don't know how to do that anymore. I don't know how to be the person I once was, Jane said, and felt suddenly a little tearful, realizing that she had finally hit the nail on the head. She didn't know how to be the person she once was. She didn't really know who that person had been. Honey, none of us are the person we once were, not even me. We don't have to be, do we? Why can't we just be who we are now? Honestly, the person you are now is so changed, because you've learned so much. And as for plans, look what you've achieved. If it hadn't been for your idea to get you and Elsie into your saddles and working your hides off every single day, the Wild Meadow Ranch would be a distant memory. Who on earth has time for making other plans in the middle of all that? I think that's kind of my point. And my point is that the person you are now, the very fine woman you are, can still make a dress if she wants to. You don't have to wind the clock back to your school days before you're allowed to ride down into Grafton Crest and buy some pretty fabric, do you? You can just buy it and make something out of it. Trust you to be right, Eileen Thornton. Jane said and laughed. The truth was, Eileen was right. She wasn't always the most logical or practical person in the world, but when she was, it was always at the most perfect time. Of course, Jane knew that things as complicated as feelings didn't shift overnight, and it was going to be a long time before she found out exactly who she was now and how to live with the woman she had become. But in the meantime, maybe she could just go out and buy a little fabric and make a pretty dress for the occasional barn dance and just see what happened. I'm always right. Eileen chuckled. But actually, if you do want to wind back the clock to your school days, then look no further than the handsome man my Barney is in deep conversation with. The man with his back to us? David Clark, no less. David Clark? Goodness, I have changed, Jane sighed. There was a time when she would have known David Clark from 200 yards away in the dark. He had been the obsession of her burgeoning womanhood, the ideal man, absolute perfection. He was just a year older than they were and had gone through most of school with them. He was only ever an acquaintance, but he was always pleasant, polite, and extraordinarily handsome. As she stared at his back, Jane tried to conjure up his face. He had wonderfully dark hair, olive skin, and bright blue eyes. He had the sort of face that was both boyish and manly, and she wondered if that had changed much. Jane knew that he went to the same church as her every Sunday, but it had been a long time since she had looked his way. With so many cares of her own, her old obsession had fallen by the wayside. She had long since dismissed him as a man who would much prefer to be married to a carefree young woman. One who didn't spend all day charging about the plains on horseback. Well, let's see if we can't rekindle a little something of that old infatuation tonight, shall we? Eileen said, and Jane closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh. She wasn't sure if it was of anticipation or fear. Chapter 4. Well, Barney, I reckon your bride-to-be sure is a patient lady. Are you sure she doesn't feel ignored with you shooting the breeze half the night instead of dancing? David Clark grinned at Barney Brown. You've seen me dance, David. I'm doing the woman a favor, believe me. David had always liked Barney. They'd been through school together, being just about the same age, and had never had a cross word between them. They were never the very best of friends, rather just good casual friends, but David was always pleased to see him, and he gathered that Barney felt similarly. "I suppose so." David laughed before his attention was drawn by the young woman sitting beside Eileen Thornton. Surely, it was Jane Meadows. He stared a little more intently to be absolutely sure. It wasn't that he didn't recognize her, exactly, but rather that he hadn't expected to see her there in the town barn. It had been a long time since David had seen her anywhere other than church. Even then, he so rarely, if ever, had the opportunity to have a moment or two of conversation with her. Over time, there had been something a little careworn about the young woman who had always been so bright and cheerful, and David had never really had the courage to approach her to find out more. It was as if there was a wall around her, an invisible wall which she had built up to keep everybody else out. Of course, he didn't know her well enough to know if this was true or not. It was just a feeling he had. Perhaps it was nothing more than extraordinarily hard work which made her a little quiet in the last couple years, not to mention the untimely death of her father, Cal Meadows. He didn't know the family well, but what he knew of them he liked, and Cal Meadows' passing had been something which had affected all of Grafton Crest. David had felt greatly for their loss, always wishing that he had known Jane a little better, just well enough to be able to approach her and talk about her cares would have done. There had always been something about Jane which had held his attention. It wasn't exactly something he could put his finger on, and he was certain it wasn't just the fact that she was so beautiful. She was, of course, very beautiful, with her thick golden hair and gentle smile. And yet he knew that it was something else, something beyond that. If it was simply beauty, she would have been like so many other young women in Grafton Crest. "Is that Jane Meadows?" he asked, feigning unrecognition as a means of turning the conversation Jane's way. "Sure is," Barney said before taking a deep gulp of the rum-filled punch. "My Eileen has tried time and time again to get Jane to come out for a while now. I reckon this is Jane's first dance for a long time. I didn't want to interfere, they seem to be having a heart-to-heart of some kind. I guess Jane's had things pretty rough these last couple of years," David said, and wished that they could make their way over to them. Surely, being in Barney's company would give him all the excuse he needed to get closer to Jane. "That's right enough. I don't think the poor girl has looked up since her father died. Word has it that she is a very fine rancher these days. That sure is impressive." "Let's go on over," Barney said, seeming to make a firm decision before swallowing down the rest of his drink and setting the small cup on the nearest table. "Sure," David said, glad to have his excuse at last. But as they began to pick their way through the crowd, David was waylaid as always. This time it was Jennifer Wesley, a real beauty and only 17 years old. "I hope you're going to dance at some point this evening, David," she said, twiddling her glossy brown curls as she stood with her head coquettishly on one side. "It sure would be a shame if you spent the whole time talking." "Well, I reckon I'll do just a little more talking first, Jennifer," he said, and gave her a dismissive smile which the young woman chose to ignore. "I sure do hope you have a dance saved for me tonight," she went on, undeterred. David felt his heart sink. He had no desire to dance with her, however pretty she might be, however interested in him she was. Worse still, he could see that the little conversation was drawing attention from one or two other hopeful young ladies, and he gathered that this would not be the only bold approach of the evening. "Now, you know that men don't have dance cards, Jennifer," he said humorously, hoping to bat her away with a little comedy. "Maybe your dance card is in here," she said, and reached out with exaggerated femininity to tap the side of his head with her fingers. How tired he was of such performances, how much he began to wish that he wasn't quite so handsome and that his father wasn't quite so successful. If he came from farming stock and had a blissfully tilted nose, At least he would be able to enjoy an evening in peace without so many interruptions from young ladies who could only see what was obvious, having no ability at all to dig for what was underneath. He looked at Barney a little helplessly, hoping that his friend would see past his own amusement for long enough to extricate him. "Well, David, my girl is calling us over," Barney said, "right on time." "Please excuse me, Jennifer," David said and gave her a brief smile, careful not to make eye contact with her. "Don't you go forgetting me now," she said with what she was obviously convinced was a seductive smile before she turned and slowly sashayed away. "Thank you, Barney. Yours is a funny sort of a problem, isn't it? There's many a man who wouldn't see it as a problem at all. Very funny." "Oh, there you are," Eileen Thornton said brightly as the two of them approached. "Ladies," Barney said in a humorously deep voice as he lifted an imaginary hat. "David, how nice to see you," Eileen went on, smiling up at him from her perch on the bale of hay. "And you remember Jane, of course?" "Of course," he said and turned his attention to the beautiful blonde. "It sure is nice to see you here, Jane. I guess you've been something of a stranger for a while." "Yes, I suppose I have been." "It's nice to see you too, David," she said and seemed a little shy and awkward. David was a little taken aback, for he had never known her to be a particularly shy woman. He was suddenly struck by the idea that she had dropped her confidence on the way into the barn. Perhaps that was what being out of such gatherings for so long did to a person. Whatever it was, he realized he felt a little sorry for her. "How are things at Wild Meadow? Picking up again now, I hope?" he asked, already really knowing the answer to his question. The whole town knew that the Meadows family, with the help of Garth Martin, had defied the will and might of the Claytons. A rich family who had moved into town before Cal's death and had tried to buy up everything, including the Meadows ranch. Against all the odds, the Meadows had kept a firm hold on what was theirs, never once bowing to the pressure that Dale Clayton applied. There were certainly those in Grafton Crest who admired that grit deeply. The Claytons, of course, would undoubtedly see it as their one big failure, perhaps even a source of humiliation. "Things have picked up nicely, thank you," she said and, despite the fact her skin was tanned and it was a little gloomy in the barn, David was sure that Jane was blushing. Thanks to Jane and all her hard work, Eileen Thornton picked up the slack. If she hadn't taken to horseback with her sister and worked her insides out these last 2 years, they sure would have gone under. Now, that's an achievement right there, isn't it? Eileen looked at David expectantly. He'd always liked Eileen, the two young women seemed to make such a well-matched pair. At school, they had always been the height of fun and frolics, somehow managing to come out of the whole thing with an education. David had always been a little shy himself, never quite feeling that he fit in with the children of ranchers and farmers, blacksmiths and merchants. There was only one attorney in Grafton Crest, and his father was it. Something about that had set him to one side and, without ever bullying him or even excluding him, David had known that he wasn't comfortable company for his classmates. His younger self had dreamed of being a part of things, even a little important to the likes of Jane and Eileen. But his confidence had been slow to develop, only coming to him now, bit by bit, with age and experience. He was grateful for small mercies, as it were. There's not many in Grafton Crest who can lay claim to such an achievement. "I guess what you all managed at Wild Meadow has become something of a legend in town," he said, looking directly at Jane as he answered Eileen's question. "That sure is kind of you, David," Jane said and smiled back at him. She looked so beautiful in her blue dress, her thick hair pinned up and her long lean arms and face nicely tanned. Her eyes were the same as he remembered them, a pretty cornflower blue, and he realized that he was as transfixed by Jane Meadows now as he'd always been. Of course, it was hardly something he could tell her, was it? But perhaps there would be some way to get to know her a little better, if only he could find it. "It's nice to see you here in the barn again. Maybe you have a little more time these days to enjoy yourself?" he asked, already trying to set a plan in motion. "I do hope so, David. Things really were quite hectic, but perhaps not quite so hectic now as they once were," she said, and seemed to be warming up just a little. However, at that very moment, another hopeful young lady of Grafton Crest made her approach. Such things were, as far as he was concerned, kind of brazen. For one thing, he was clearly in conversation with somebody else, and he wondered why it was such things were so readily ignored. Perhaps he ought to have sat down, instead of towering above Jane as if his visit was a transient affair. If he'd been sitting next to her, or opposite her, Rhonda Burton might not have felt so emboldened as to make her approach. "I hope you're dancing tonight, David," Rhonda said in a shrill voice which made her beautiful face somehow much less so. "Oh, not just at the moment," he said and smiled, wondering what line his admirers would open with if he had a wooden leg. It seemed to him that being determined he should dance was somehow universal. Perhaps he would get himself a cane for future visits, claiming a limp so that he might have a little peace. But then, how would he ever ask Jane to dance? With a sigh, he turned to Rhonda Burton, knowing that he would have to exchange a few sentences at least before he could dispatch her successfully. Chapter 5. Jane could hear the laughter spilling from the open window of the ranch house as she made her exhausted way from the stables. It was undoubtedly Eileen paying a visit, and she wondered just how long her mother and best friend had been sitting at the table in the kitchen discussing Jane and her life. Not that she minded, for it was quite clear to Jane that both women only had the best of intentions for her. Elsie and Garth had gone out on the now weekly trip up north for supplies. The busier they got, the more successful they became, and the more they needed. Buying from anywhere in Grafton Crest was still out of the question, and likely always would be for as long as there were Claytons in their part of Colorado hiking the prices to anyone who resisted them. Jane frowned. That was likely to be forever. By the time she reached the kitchen door, Jane had dismissed all thoughts of the Claytons from her mind. She didn't want them spoiling whatever fun conversation was in store for her. And Jane was certain it would be fun, for she had thought of little else but David for 3 whole days since the barn dance. She had no doubt that her mother and Eileen would be only too keen to have him at the forefront of any and all conversations. "Ah, there you are, Jane. I wondered if you were ever going to finish work for the day," her mother said when she made her way in. "It's always a long day when the others are up north." "I don't reckon they'll be back for a while yet," Jane said as she took off her broad-brimmed hat and set it down on the chair by the empty fire grate before taking a seat at the table. "They took Joel with them in the end. I wasn't going to let him take the day out of school, but he ground me down." Charlotte Martin was already on her feet and cutting bread and cheese for her daughter. "I'll be making dinner late, so will this keep you going until then?" "Oh yes. Thanks, Ma. That'll be just fine. I hope you don't mind me coming over in the middle of your working week, Jane," Eileen said with a smile. "No, of course not. It's lovely to see you. I just thought you might be tired." "No, I'm just fine." Jane gripped Eileen's hand for a moment. "Eileen was telling me about the barn dance, Jane," her mother said in a wheedling tone. "Far more than you told me, anyways. For one thing, I didn't know you'd seen David Clark." She wandered back to the table and set the food out in front of Jane. Turning to Eileen she said, "Can I get you anything, honey?" "No, I'm fine with my peach tea, thank you." Eileen smiled. Well, David Clark always used to go to the barn dance, Ma. Half the town goes. I didn't tell you who else was there either. Jane knew she was deflecting, but it amused her a little. I know, but you didn't have a crush on the rest of them, just David Clark. Ma. I was a girl then. I was at school. I remember you liking that boy beyond school. Her mother was bright-eyed. Jane knew she was enjoying the whole thing as much as her mother was. It was nice to see how thrilled her mother was for her, even though it had been nothing more than a simple night out at the barn dance. How was it that something which used to be so commonplace for her was now a cause for celebration in the Meadows household? Just a sign of the twists and turns life takes, she guessed. She was head over heels. We used to talk about nothing but David. It was David Clark this, David Clark that, all day long. Obviously, we used to talk about Barney too. Eileen chuckled in a way which reminded Jane of their shared youth. We were 15, Eileen, Jane said through a mouthful of bread and cheese. Sorry, she said, remembering her manners as one or two crumbs escaped her mouth and landed back down on the plate. I guess I really have changed a little since then. Poor David, huh? She went on as she surveyed the crumbs. I'm sure he wouldn't mind a crumb or two, Eileen said, her shoulders shaking with amusement as the rumble of laughter began to make its way out. I think it's a little bit more than a crumb or two, Eileen, Jane said, looking doubtfully down at her apparel. How about these for a start, she said, lifting her knee and pulling at the thick fabric of her work trousers. And then these, she said, plucking at the fabric of her plaid shirt similarly. Ah, but you wear them well, honey. And in any case, it's not like you have to stride into the barn dance in that get-up, is it? Eileen was still chuckling. You always look beautiful, Jane. It doesn't matter what you're wearing, but you might want to attend to the fact you've gone back to speaking with your mouth full of food like you used to when we were little. Consider it done, Jane said before taking another large bite of the bread and rolling her eyes. So, David spent a little time with you at the barn dance, did he? Her mother said, clearly already having had every detail from Eileen but wanting to hear it again from her daughter. Jane said, nodding and pointing at her closed lips as she continued to chew. Eileen, as thrilled with any silly behavior as she had always been, laughed excitedly before saying, he came over with Barney and he looked real pleased about it too. He was hardly going to look annoyed, was he? I mean, he's a polite young man, Jane said, eyeing the last mouthful of bread and cheese and deciding to leave it until their conversation was over. Come on, Jane. That was more than just good manners. Eileen objected. You know, I would love to believe that, really I would. But I'm not sure David even noticed me back in the days when I was a little better turned out. And don't tell me you didn't see all the girls hanging around him, all trying to get him to dance. I did, but that's hardly his fault, is it? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that somebody like David gets to have his pick of the bunch. We don't even know that he is a single man, do we? He might already have a girl for all we know. And even if he doesn't, he really could choose any girl in Grafton Crest, any girl at all. He's so handsome, and don't forget that he now works in his daddy's law practice, doesn't he? He's got a proper education from a real college and the sort of prospects you don't see every day in this part of Colorado. Can you imagine his daddy being pleased to see his only son and heir tipping his hat at a young woman on horseback who also happens to be wearing these trousers? Don't defeat yourself before you've even begun, honey, Charlotte Martin said in a voice that was a little too determinately upbeat. Jane knew then that her mother had seen the sense in her words, even if she no more wanted them to be true than Jane did. Something about the look in her mother's eye made Jane feel sad. I don't want to defeat myself, but I don't want to disappoint myself either. I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think it'd be wise to go getting my hopes up. After all, I only went out that one night. But it's not the last, Eileen said with her humor turning to concern. Please don't think about hiding away again when it's taken me so long to draw you out. I'm not hiding away, I'm just not getting ahead of myself. All right, Eileen flashed a conspiratorial look at Jane's mother. So, in that spirit, I've put us both down for the auditions. Jane, who had just taken a sip of peach tea, almost spat it out. Auditions? What auditions? Her eyes were wide and incredulous. The town play auditions, what else? Eileen was trying to brazen it out, but her pretty cheeks were flushed suddenly. Oh, what a wonderful idea! With such instant enthusiasm, it was clear that Charlotte had already heard it all from Eileen. Still, it was all part of their caring, and Jane didn't mind the fact that the two women had clearly planned it. You used to love the town play, Jane. Watching it, Ma, not starring in it. Jane was laughing now, knowing that she most certainly would not be taking part in the auditions. Well, now's your chance to get involved in it all. And me too. Eileen was already wheedling. No, no, and again, no. Jane said raucously. But I already put us on the list. The auditions are Friday night in the barn, Eileen wailed. I don't want to be in the town play. But I do. I never had the guts to put my name down before. Well, I'll come with you, then. I'll be right there in the barn to support you, but I don't want a part in the play. That's as good an offer as you're going to get, Eileen Thornton, so you might as well give up now. All right, if that's your last word, Eileen said, and Jane was amazed that her friend had given up so easily. It wasn't like Eileen at all. It'll be nice, Jane. It'll get you out of the house, Charlotte said gently. And then there's the dance on Saturday. Just think, out of the house on Friday and Saturday. Ma, I never said I was going to the barn dance on Saturday too. Jane could feel things getting away from her, moving far too fast. The truth was that she didn't think she wanted another night of watching her old crush being fawned over by every pretty girl in town. It had been so nice to speak to him again after so long, but Jane could already feel the tendrils of her old feelings sneaking out of their hiding place to wind their way around her heart. If she wasn't careful, she'd be the same old lovelorn girl she was back then. Only this time, it wouldn't be a wonderful kind of lovelorn, but something very different. As an adult with life having taken a few chunks out of her, Jane knew she would feel it very keenly if David set his heart on someone else. That's if he hadn't already. Please, Eileen said, all big eyes and gentle pleading. I never enjoyed the barn dance without you, honey. Oh, you too. Jane said with an exaggerated sigh. You're working together now, and I don't have the strength to fight you off. Then there's no point in trying, Jane. Just go along with it. You know we only want you to have a little fun from time to time, her mother said and smiled in that wonderfully warm and maternal way that Jane always loved. All right, I'll go to the auditions and the dance. Happy? Happy, Eileen and Charlotte said in unison. Chapter 6. There sure are a lot of wagons out here tonight, Jane said when she and Eileen walked arm in arm towards the town barn. Wearing one of her more presentable dresses, she had ridden down from the ranch to Eileen's home and left her horse there so that they might make the 5-minute walk to the barn together. It was a balmy kind of night with all manner of summer scents on the air. Some pleasant, some less so. Annie Baldwin says it's always like this on auditions night. I guess there are a whole lot of frustrated actors in Grafton Crest. Eileen laughed. Including you? Jane gave her a teasing look. Especially me. Were you supposed to dress up already? Jane asked, confused as she looked around at overdressed women and men carrying all manner of ridiculous props. No, I guess some folk are even more desperate than I am. Eileen chuckled. Half of this stuff isn't even in the play. Look, Charlie Matthews is carrying a scarecrow. There isn't a scarecrow in the whole thing. Perhaps it's the scarecrow who's auditioning and Charlie is just giving him a ride down to the barn. Jane suppressed what ought to have been hoots of laughter. It felt good. This was Jane and Eileen as they'd always been. It was like a wonderful tonic which had the power to wipe away all the doubt and insecurity she had been feeling of late. She felt suddenly carefree as the two of them made their way, still arm in arm, into the barn. There seemed to be even more people inside the barn than outside, and Jane breathed a secret sigh of relief that she was only watching, not auditioning. She looked sideways at Eileen but could detect no misgivings whatsoever. Classic Eileen. Is Barney here tonight? No, he says he doesn't want me to shoehorn him into auditioning for something. He doesn't trust me. Eileen rolled her eyes. The place was more packed than Jane had ever seen it. Even the barn dance didn't attract this many. Spying 2 free seats closer to the front, Jane pulled Eileen along through the crowd. If nothing else, this evening sure would be an entertaining one. There was so much chatter and noise that when it suddenly died down, Jane knew something of note was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, came a roar from the makeshift stage. Settle down, settle down. Jane looked up at the stage to see Arlon Myers standing there with his arms raised and his palms facing outward. He was, and always had been, the man in charge of the town play. Not only did he generally write it, but he always directed it, with the help of whoever could put up with his pedantic ways for a season. He was a nice man, as far as she knew, but perhaps a little too intense when it came to staging one of his masterpieces. Jane grinned to herself. He was actually a pretty good storyteller, if she was honest. So, we're going to get through the ladies' auditions first tonight, starting with the hopefuls for the part of the leading lady, Camilla Winchester, he said, and an excited murmur went through the crowd, most particularly the women. Camilla Winchester? Jane whispered in Eileen's ear. Yes, that's the leading lady character. I'm guessing this is going to be one of his old England plays? Jane said and was pleased. She liked the romantic kind of tales. A fancy drawing-room drama, Eileen said, in just about the most unrecognizable English accent Jane had ever heard. Goodness, I hope you're going for a non-speaking part, Jane said, barely able to contain her laughter as Eileen gave her a withering look. Oh, Annie Baldwin is first up, Eileen said in a loud whisper, her attention suitably drawn away. As a hush fell over the barn, Jane looked over at the stage with a pleasant sense of anticipation. Annie Baldwin always got a good part in the town play. She was something of a natural. Jane had always liked her and had always enjoyed watching her throw herself into whatever part she got. Annie was a modest young woman, quite unexpected in one so talented, and she walked up onto the stage without any fuss or flamboyance whatsoever. Arlon had a minute or so of conversation with her, handing her a sheet of paper with what were presumably the lines she needed for the audition. As he spoke, Annie ran her finger down the page, line for line, taking it all in. After another minute, Annie nodded at Arlon to indicate that she was ready to begin. I do not know how much longer I can go on like this, Mr. Ravenswood, Annie began, completely in character and with such a fine English accent that Jane's eyes widened with admiration. "I know it is not the done thing, sir, but my feelings are such that I cannot, in truth, hold on to them a moment longer." "I would give anything to hear such words from you, Miss Winchester," Arlon said in a less than perfect English accent as he took on the role of the leading man for audition purposes. "How long I have dreamed of you, my dear. How long I have yearned for you." "Dear, oh dear," Eileen began. "Can you imagine two young lovebirds at the town barn dance here in Grafton Crest talking to one another like that?" Jane didn't speak, she simply bit down on her lower lip to avoid laughing. "Then I shall speak plainly, sir, since you do not seem to have an aversion to such things," Annie said, seeming to have no problem at all with the tortuously unfamiliar version of their own language. "I shall speak plainly and tell you that I have been truly in love with you for as long as I can remember. I cannot imagine my life without you. And I cannot imagine my life without you, Miss Winchester." "Camilla," Arlon said in such a breathy way that Jane was forced to bite her lip all the harder. For all that he was good at writing stories and plays, Arlon Myers should never, ever tread the boards. Never had she seen someone so ill-suited to any pastime in her life. "Oh, Mr. Ravenswood, I could cry. I have never felt like this in all my life." Annie Baldwin looked up at him with what appeared to be genuine love. She was good. "I love you, Camilla. I know I have been distant, I know I have not always been so obvious in my affections, but I have felt them, nonetheless. I have felt them deeply, relentlessly, and they have never let me go once since first they began." Arlon took a few clumsy paces towards Annie. "I hardly sleep for thoughts of you, my dear, night after night. You fill my waking thoughts, you steal my sleep, you haunt my dreams," and now he reached out to take her hand. "In all of my own dreams, sir, I could never have truly believed this day would ever come. These words, these beautiful words, had I dreamed them, I would not have believed them." "Oh, Mr. Ravenswood," Annie said, her performance somehow making up for Arlon's own. "Aloysius," she went on, finally leaning her head against Arlon's chest. The two remained unmoving and silent for a moment or two before the gathered audience realized that the little scene, just enough for the audition, had come to an end. There was a raucous round of applause from all, Jane included. "Aloysius?" Jane said when the applause had died down enough for her friend to be able to hear her. "I do think he's made a mistake there." She began to chuckle. "It is a little bit overly fancy, isn't it?" Eileen said and winced. "Still, I hope Annie gets the part," Jane said honestly. "She always works so hard at this, and did you hear that accent? It's like she was born there." "That's true. I knew there was no point in going in for that part myself." "What part have you gone in for?" Jane asked, realizing she ought to have asked Eileen before. "Any one of Aloysius Ravenswood's sisters. None of them have a huge part, but they do get to wander about on the stage quite a bit." "That will do for me," Eileen said and nodded. "Louisa Clayton," Arlon Myers' shout brought a little bit of order to the room again. "Louisa Clayton, whenever you're ready," he said, scanning the crowd for any sign of her. "Might have known she'd be here trying to get herself the best part in the whole play," Eileen said with an undisguised and sizable helping of rancor. "Is there nothing that family won't elbow their way into?" "Perhaps she's good at this sort of thing," Jane said, absolutely determined to hold on to her dignity. Louisa Clayton was the most unpleasant young woman. The oldest daughter of Dale Clayton, Louisa strutted about Grafton Crest like she owned the place. Of course, her family did now own a fair proportion of it. Her day-to-day clothes were all the most recent fashions from New York, and better than anything Jane had for her very best outfit. "Here I am," Louisa Clayton called out dramatically as she walked up the little wooden steps to the stage. With every step, Louisa was turning to face the audience, almost as if this was the opening night and not the auditions. She pranced her way across the stage to Arlon, taking the sheet of paper from him and studying it for a moment or two. "I don't think the Claytons are good at anything, Jane. I think they are so used to buying and bullying their way into things that they just expect everything to land at their feet. I'll bet you a whole dollar that Louisa is absolutely terrible," Eileen said, unwilling to give up her dislike. "I think we are about to find out," Jane said with raised eyebrows. Turning her attention to the stage again, Jane realized that it was still peculiarly painful to set eyes on any member of the Clayton family, even now. She knew, of course, that Louisa Clayton could not be blamed for her father's dreadful behavior. Louisa had been a girl of 15 when her father had begun to put the most dreadful squeeze on Meadows, Jane's father, causing, as her entire family believed to be true, his untimely death. Although she knew that Louisa could not possibly have had a part in any of that, still it did something to her insides to see the prancing young woman, now 18, in any setting. She was always overconfident and arrogant, and even had been as a girl, and Jane hated to admit she was somewhat intimidated by the perfectly turned-out younger woman. "I do not know how much longer I can go on like this, Mr. Ravenswood," Louisa began so suddenly that the entire room fell into a surprised silence. Her accent was gratifyingly appalling, being somewhere between Southern belle and French mademoiselle. Jane felt Eileen's sharp intake of breath as well as heard it. If the young woman on the stage hadn't been the daughter of Grafton Crest's most powerful and unforgiving man, there might have been a rumble or two of muted laughter. "I know it is not the done thing, sir, but my feelings are such that I cannot, in truth, hold on to them a moment longer." When she delivered the second part of her first line, Louisa Clayton spoke to the audience, rather than to her leading man. She stared wistfully out over the crowd, her arms outstretched in an almost begging fashion. It was just about the worst bit of overacting that Jane had ever seen, and she allowed herself a silent moment of pleasure which she truly knew she ought to have risen above. Over the last few years, her mother had taught her the meaning of poise and dignity as far as the Claytons were concerned. To deal with them, even to rail against them, was to hand them your power. That was what her mother always said. The rest of Louisa's performance went along in much the same vein and, as the night wore on, it was clear that she was the only person in the barn whose acting skills could make Arlon Meyer's own look polished and perfect. The parts for the three sisters were taking a little time to get through. Arlon had written out only a few lines spoken by one of the sisters, telling the gathered ladies that he would be able to tell which sister they would be suited to based on that alone. So, the words of the eldest sister were called out again and again for almost half an hour. In the end, Jane thought she could recite it herself without a need for the now worn piece of paper passed from hopeful to hopeful. Jane Meadows. When her name was called loudly from the stage, Jane sat bolt upright in her seat. She looked at Eileen, whose eyes were wide and full of guilty remembrance. "Eileen?" Jane said in a dangerous, low voice. "Oh, I knew there was something I meant to do this week," Eileen said and raised a hand to each side of her face. "Oh, Jane, I forgot." Jane Meadows. Arlon Myers bellowed again as Jane tentatively got to her feet. They were just a few rows back from the front and Jane stood there, cheeks flushing, holding hands out in front of her as if to fend off Arlon's gaze. "The thing is, I hadn't meant to. I mean, I'm not supposed to be." She was cut short by a shrill laugh from the front row and looked over to see Louisa Clayton staring back at her. As always, Louisa was confident, clearly believing that her ridiculous performance for leading lady was the best. And now she was staring at Jane, belittling her with her shrill laugh and her searching little eyes. Well, Jane wasn't going to be entertainment for that little madam. Without another word, Jane began to make her way towards the stage, turning to throw a scowl back in Eileen's direction as she did so. She knew that Eileen would never have put her in such a position, and she was in no doubt whatsoever that her dear friend had simply forgotten to take Jane's name off the list of audition hopefuls. She also knew that, once the humiliation had settled down, that she would forgive Eileen and the two of them would find something to laugh at. They would be telling the tale over and over again of Eileen's forgetfulness and Jane's ridiculous performance on stage. But that time hadn't yet come and, as it stood, Jane wanted to tip her best friend clean off her seat. "Are you all right, Jane?" Arlon Myers whispered to her the moment she joined him on stage. "Yes, I'm just fine, thank you," she said, feeling anything but. "Here, take this, and just begin whenever you're ready," Arlon said, handing her the well-handled sheet of paper. Jane had seen enough young women perform these few short lines to be able to make a passable effort at it. She most certainly didn't want a part in the play, but she didn't particularly want to make a fool of herself in that very moment either. And so, with a final look at the words she already knew by heart, Jane began. "I do wish you would let us have a ball here at Pennington Manor, Aloysius," Jane began, and thought her English accent was a little better than she'd been expecting. However, it was clear that Louisa Clayton felt differently, and she made her feelings known with a pretty little snigger from the front row. After half the town had been forced to sit through her ridiculous attempt, all of them silent, nobody daring to laugh or make a murmur, now that haughty, self-confident little brat was going to laugh at her. Suddenly, Jane was absolutely furious. She would get her lines said and then she would march off the stage and back to her seat, delivering a sharp kick to Louisa Clayton's shins on her way past. "It is all such a lot of work, my dear sister," Arlon said, his accent still not improving any. "Well, our father would have let us have a ball, Aloysius." Jane delivered the line with such vehemence it almost bordered on viciousness. "And if you do not make us happy in some small way, brother, I shall begin to think you are not half as kind as dear Papa was," she went on, her fury giving her the perfectly clipped and strident tone of a privileged upper-class young English woman. "Very well, Verity, you may have your ball. I can see the whole matter has upset you, and I apologize. Really, you must not get yourself in such a state. I cannot bear to see such a gentle soul as you so downcast," Arlon finished, and that, as they say, was that. Jane almost laughed herself to hear the character she had just portrayed described as gentle. There was the same tired and tepid applause as there had been for the previous 10 Grafton Crest women who had tried out for the role of one of the three sisters. However, Arlon Myers was studying her with interest, his head tilted to one side and his eyes narrowed as if something about her angry little performance had given him something to think about. "Thank you, Jane," he said, still nodding thoughtfully at her. "Thank you," she said, and walked off the stage with as much dignity as she could muster. However, when she was but 3 steps down from the top, Jane saw a face she recognized towards the back of the barn. She closed her eyes and sighed inwardly. It was David Clark. Chapter 7. David had hoped that Jane would be in the barn that night. Barney Brown, whom he had run into in the diner the day before, had mentioned in passing that Eileen was going to chance her arm at getting a part in the town play this year. As Eileen busily worked away, Grafton Crest's most long-serving waitress in the diner, the two men had chatted happily about the flurry of interest always generated by the town play. David admitted to taking part in the whole thing for the last couple of years, and Barney had complimented him on his past performances, being a man who never missed the yearly drama even though he had no desire to take a part in it. David had wanted to ask if Jane would be going along with Eileen, but Barney, as pleasant and friendly as he was also a little unguarded at times and would think nothing of divulging David's interest in her movements to Jane herself. And so, David had gone down to the town barn with high hopes of auditioning for the part of leading man this year, and even higher hopes of seeing Jane there too. However, when Arlon Myers called her name and Jane got to her feet, David's heart sank. He could see from her very demeanor that she didn't want to go up onto the stage. Something, in the end, propelled her forward, although he didn't know what. She just seemed to come to a sudden decision and set off. By the time she reached the stage, David had hoped it was nothing more than a little bout of nerves. As far as he was concerned, her first line had been delivered beautifully. She had such a lovely voice, such a clear voice that it could be heard at the very back of the barn without her having to shout. In fact, by the time she had got to the end of that first line, David was already wishing that she had chosen to audition for the part of leading lady. He had no idea who had snorted with derision, all he could say was that it was somebody down near the front of things. Suddenly, Jane's performance became something else altogether and, while her accent was perfect for the play, he wasn't sure that her obvious anger would see Arlon offering her any part at all. It would be a great shame, David thought, for he surely would have looked forward to rehearsals so much more if he knew that Jane would be there. He'd been thinking about her ever since the previous Saturday's barn dance. The truth was that he'd left the barn after the dance with a feeling of complete exasperation. He'd been hounded all night by various young women and, in the end, Jane had turned to Eileen and the two of them had become locked in a deep conversation, one that he didn't feel he could interrupt once he had been set free by one of his many tedious admirers. David wished that he had just brushed them off, but what would Jane have thought of him had he done so? He wasn't a rude man by nature, especially where women were concerned, and he would have hated to think that Jane thought him boorish or even aggressive. In the end, he realized he'd hardly had any time with her at all and, more importantly, he realized that that was the thing he had wanted the most. Jane was like a ghost from his past, an indistinct vision from his late boyhood. She had been a goddess to him then, one he had hardly dared to approach. And now she was different, a little quieter, but still with her old poise and dignity. David knew that life had not been kind to her, all of Grafton Crest knew that, but it hadn't finished her off. There was a wariness about her now, but it was not so strong that it could entirely obliterate the light in those beautiful blue eyes. She was leaner and tanned, but every bit as beautiful as she had been back then. More beautiful, because there was a certain substance to her now that had not been there before. Of course, David knew that substance was not a thing a young person developed while still in the schoolroom. And his young self had only cared about her beautiful face and her heartbreakingly melodic voice. There was more to her now, there was a character there, a character he wanted to know more about. Jane hadn't danced all night at the barn dance and, once or twice, there was a look which crossed her face, a look which suggested that she was almost ready to get up from the hay bale and make a run for it. There was a coltish wariness about her, a vigilance, almost as if she had been expecting something unpleasant to happen. Perhaps it was just awkwardness, the sort of awkwardness that is born of being out of things for so long. Something about that made him want to sit by her side on the hay bale and hold her hand, anything to reassure her that everything was going to be all right. But David didn't know her well enough for such things and he wondered if he ever would. With her curiously angry performance over and done with, Jane had begun to make her way down from the stage. Halfway down the steps, she'd looked out into the crowd and he fancied that she saw him there and held his gaze for half a second. Of course, David knew that it was likely to be nothing more than wishful thinking on his part and, as she marched across the room to retake her seat, he wondered if he would get an opportunity to speak to her that evening. It was Eileen Thornton's performance which did, in the end, give David the very opportunity he had been hoping for. Perhaps not even an opportunity, but certainly an excuse to make his way over to the two ladies for a few minutes of conversation. The room, at the end of the auditions, began to rapidly empty. The whole thing seemed to have gone on for hours and hours, and, by the time he had gone up to make his own performance, David had been too tired to feel any hint of nerves. Perhaps that was a good thing, perhaps not. 4 other men had tried out for the part of leading man, so only time would tell if David's performance had cut the mustard. "Eileen, what a shame Barney isn't here tonight," David said, smiling as he approached them both. He was careful to make eye contact with Eileen first, cautious about having Jane realize his eagerness. "He sure would have been proud of you. That was a very fine accent you had there, that's for sure." "Thank you kindly, sir," Eileen said, still in character as she bowed, rather than curtsied. She was a character enough, with or without a role in the play, and he made sure his laughter was nothing more than good-natured. Eileen had, in many ways, stolen the night. Her own performance as Verity had been something he would never forget. Her accent had been excellent, for an elderly Englishwoman barking at her servants, that is. The crowd loved it, although it was certainly a million miles away from the character of a young woman. It was a feisty old lady kind of performance, but he suspected that Eileen could only make the accent stick if she deployed it slowly, loudly, and in a kind of cranky manner. "And I liked your audition too, Jane," he said, turning to her at last. She smiled at him sedately, as if she didn't believe him for a minute, and said, "Thank you. We'll all have to wait a couple of days until we hear who got what parts," Eileen said, and David smiled. "I guess so. I think you'll get the role you want, David." "You did real well up there," Jane said, and David wished, once again, that she had gone for the leading lady role. He was certain that Annie Baldwin would be the leading lady in the end. She was great and she deserved it based on her performance, but Jane was the one he wanted to kiss in the last scene, not Annie. He couldn't imagine Louisa Clayton getting the part, but who knew? The Claytons were a big noise in Grafton Crest, and this was the first time Louisa had tried out for a part in the play. It would remain to be seen whether Arlon had the courage to do the right thing or if he would bend and break like so many in Grafton Crest did in the face of the Claytons' wealth and power. "Thanks, Jane. I hope we all get parts. It sure would be fun to come to rehearsals then, wouldn't it?" "It sure would," Eileen agreed, and Jane mutely nodded. He could tell Jane wanted to be out of there. She was suffering on account of her audition and he knew it. A part of him wanted to keep her there, to worm some conversation out of her and enjoy her presence for just a few minutes longer. But he liked her, he cared about her, and he didn't want her to stand there feeling embarrassed when all she wanted to do was get away from the barn at high speed. "Well, I guess I'll be going," he said with a sinking heart. Chapter 8. "You don't need to hang on here, Jane, we've got enough hands getting the work done," Garth Martin said when he rode up alongside Jane out on the top field. Despite the sad reasons for Jane having to become a ranch hand in the first place, she had always liked working alongside Garth. It seemed that he had always been a feature in their lives, and a wonderful father figure now that her own daddy was no longer around. When Garth had married her mother, nobody had been more pleased about it than Jane. "Oh, I don't like to run out on you all," Jane said, turning her horse a little to face him. "Come on, Jane, you're only taking off a little early. Eileen won't be happy if you don't show up for your rehearsals." Garth was chuckling, and she knew why. Despite not wanting a part and despite her strangely angry portrayal of Verity Ravenswood, Arlon had cast Jane for the play. Not the part of the sweet, gentle, and perpetually vaporish Verity, but her more strident and aggressive older sister, Henrietta Ravenswood. The character didn't carry much of the story, only providing a little change of scenery and mood to fill in the gaps between the hero and heroine falling in love and actually declaring it. Henrietta was more of a prop than anything, as were the other two sisters. I'm sure Eileen will manage. I know she only ended up with the role of housekeeper, but her grand accent and the way she marches up onto the stage might well steal the show when the play is finally set. Jane couldn't help but laugh. She's always been a character, Garth agreed. But it's not really about the play itself or how well either you or Eileen do in it. I guess it's just the start of things. Maybe you can pick up the reins of your old life a little more now. We have 6 ranch hands employed now. That's just 2 less than when your daddy was still here. We're just about back to where we started, honey. You've done your bit and more. Besides, it's time to take a little time for yourself. So, you don't need me anymore? Jane said, knowing that wasn't true and unable to meet Garth's eye. Instead, she stared into the distance at the far-off hills, their peaks barely visible under the cloak of fluffy white clouds. No, that's not true. You were the force which kept this place going when we all thought we were sunk. Nobody can ever take that away from you, and I know your ma is as proud of you and Elsie as I am. I would never have kept my promise to your daddy without you girls, and that's the truth. But it's not one or the other. You don't have to pick between the ranch and a life outside of it. You can have both, but having both means easing up a little on your work here. And it's not by much, is it? Just a couple of hours here and there and you have the time and strength for something to look forward to. I don't know, Jane said and shrugged. Well, I do know. And I know something else, you're every bit as stubborn as your daddy always was. A real chip off the old block. He'd be real proud of you too, Garth laughed. I only have a small part in the play, Garth, and I didn't even want that, she grinned, remembering her disbelief when she realized Eileen had forgotten to strike her name from the list of audition hopefuls. And I already know my lines off by heart, there are so few of them. She had received the full written copy of the play, just as the whole cast had, and she knew more lines than just her own. As soon as she heard that David was to play the role of Aloysius Ravenswood, she had hungrily devoured every line he was to deliver. Not only that, but she had made a very determined study of every line, every move, every romantic moment that was to be enjoyed by the leading lady. The truth was that she knew the leading lady's part from one end of the play to the other, word for word. It had and hadn't been a surprise when Annie Baldwin had been announced as the leading lady. No surprise, of course, owing to her natural talent. However, Jane was sure that she wasn't alone in her quiet admiration for Arlon. Probably almost everybody present had imagined that Louisa Clayton, poor acting skills and ridiculous stage presence notwithstanding, would snare the part of the leading lady. However, Arlon had not stood entirely firm, giving Louisa the role of Verity Ravenswood despite the fact that she hadn't auditioned for it and was certainly at the very bottom of the pile when compared with everybody else who had read the lines for that part. Still, as Grafton Crest went, Arlon still stood out more than most on account of it all. It had been with some dismay that Jane realized every interaction she had with David on stage would be confrontational. Henrietta was the willful older sister, always angry with the decisions her brother made and angrier still that he, despite being younger than her, had inherited her father's estate. There was not a single moment of gentleness between that brother and sister, and Jane wished more than ever that she were not in the play at all. She was still coming to terms with her mortification of the audition night, although she had to admit that having been given a part had gone some way to lessening it. Despite her misplaced outburst, Arlon had seen some potential there, certainly a potential she hadn't been expecting herself. Jane, Just go along for the pure enjoyment of it. It doesn't matter who has what part, who says what, or even the fact that you never wanted to be in it in the first place. Just get changed out of your work gear, go collect Eileen, and forget about this place for a while. You know a girl can worry too much about cattle and holes in fences, don't you? Garth laughed, and so did she. She knew that he was right, and she knew that he had her very best interests at heart. It was the way of Garth Martin. All he'd ever done for as long as she had known him was care about her and her family. All he'd ever wanted was the best for them, and she loved him like a father. She knew he cared for her so greatly that to see her giving over her life the way she had done had hurt him as much as it had hurt her mother. Now the both of them saw an opportunity for things to change, for Jane to claw back a little of what she once had, and she was in no doubt whatsoever that the pair of them had discussed it at length. It warmed her from the inside out to know that she was so cared for by her nearest and dearest, and it was that which made her mind up for her more than anything else. "I guess it couldn't hurt," she said, and gave a mock defeated smile while shrugging her shoulders. "That's my girl," Garth said, and he looked as if a small weight had been taken from his shoulders. Had the idea of her doing even something as simple as a couple of hours' rehearsal in the town barn for an inconsequential play really made him feel so much better? If it did, then it was just a measure of how much he cared, how much he had worried about the direction her life had been taking for the last couple of years. "All right, I'm going to leave you to it, Garth. Don't you go blaming me if you have to work an extra couple of hours and it's dark by the time you get down to the house for your dinner," Jane said, and chuckled as she started to turn her horse. "I'll live with it," Garth retorted. "Right, I'll just go down and surprise Ma and little Kathy by being early. I'm sure they'll both be real pleased to see you." "Yes, but maybe not as pleased as Eileen," Jane said with a smile as she rode slowly away back towards the house. Chapter 9. Marianne Myers sure knows how to put an outfit together, doesn't she? Eileen said, parading back and forth in her very severe-looking housekeeper's attire. It was a dress made in austere dark gray and thick material, quite high in the neck, long-sleeved, and utterly miserable. It was exactly the thing for a housekeeper in Georgian England, and only Eileen could be thrilled by the prospect of wearing such a garment in front of the whole town. It was one of the things Jane loved so well about her friend. Whatever she did in life, she threw herself into it wholeheartedly. Despite being a clever enough young woman, Eileen had taken the very first job she could find when she left the school and had stuck at it year in year out. Not only had she stuck at it, but she had embraced it every day, made it her own. For anybody else, so many days a week working in a hot and stuffy diner might have seemed like a dreadful prospect. For Eileen, it was a wonderful opportunity to chatter non-stop all day, to catch up on gossip, to gently interfere in the lives of others in a way which was only to their betterment, and, most importantly, to earn a little money that she could save week after week for the nest egg that she and Barney were building. She woke happy every day and never greeted her diners with anything other than a bright smile and a genuine desire to know how they were keeping. Jane knew that she herself hadn't attacked life in the same way. Always in some way she had a quiet resistance to it. She hadn't chosen to be a ranch hand, and yet she had decided to do it. Nobody had forced her to, it had all been her own idea, and yet she had always kept in the back of her mind that it was something she had done out of necessity. But wasn't that the case for everybody? Not just for her, but for Eileen too. Everybody worked out of necessity, and perhaps it was less a case of finding out what it was you wanted to do and more a case of finding out how to enjoy what was right there in front of you. "Only you could look adorable in that dress, Eileen," Jane said, her mood suddenly picking up as she silently berated herself for so much negative thinking about the town play, and about life in general. "And when that dress of yours is finished, you sure are going to look every bit the privileged young English woman. What a lovely color." Eileen said, reaching out to touch the dusky pink fabric that Marianne Myers had begun to construct Jane's dress in. Eileen pulled the fabric towards her a little, gripping it firmly as she studied it, inadvertently lifting the hem somewhat. "Eileen, you are going to show my ankles to all of Grafton Crest if you're not careful," Jane said in her practiced clipped English tones. Eileen squealed with laughter, highly amused by the little bit of comedy that Jane was performing in character. "As much as I would like to stand here and be terribly berated for showing the toes of your boots to the nobody who isn't here now in the drawing room, somebody is knocking at the door and I must go and answer it, for I am the housekeeper," Eileen said, also in character as she performed an elaborate curtsy and turned away as if to answer an imaginary door. "Bravo!" Suddenly, David had joined them. He was laughing heartily, clearly having witnessed the whole impromptu performance. Jane was still laughing herself, resisting the temptation to let go of her confidence and feel a little less than everybody around her. She was enjoying this moment and realized that she felt a little more like her old self. This was how she and Eileen had carried on for year after year, finding sudden amusement in almost anything that came their way. She knew it was natural that it had been taken from her when her father had died so suddenly, but she also knew that it was time to let it all back in again. It was time for her to have the courage to be herself once more. "Thank you," Eileen said and took Jane's hand and led her into a parody of the theatrical actor's bow at the end of a performance. "We aim to please," Jane added for good measure and was pleased when David laughed again. "It's a shame that little scene won't be in the play, ladies. It sure would have brightened this thing up a little," David said, making a show of looking over his shoulder lest Arlon Myers himself be standing behind him. "Maybe we'll just throw it in there for good measure," Eileen said and began to laugh before her attention was drawn by Marianne, Arlon's long-suffering sister. "Eileen, I just want to pin up the hem on that dress a little." "I don't want you tripping over it on opening night," Marianne said good-naturedly, and Eileen, lifting the dowdy gray fabric a little, followed along behind her, leaving Jane and David alone. "I guess it kind of reminds me of the schoolroom seeing you and Eileen horsing around like that," David said and smiled at her. There was something just a little bit shy and awkward about David, something which Jane couldn't quite account for. He ought to have been filled with social confidence, given that his father had such a good profession, one which David had followed him into. He was well educated and heartbreakingly handsome. What young man would not be confident with such blessings? Still, brimming with confidence or not, David could still have any girl in Grafton Crest he wanted, and Jane wasn't about to make the mistake of forgetting that. "I guess it kind of reminds me of those days too," Jane said truthfully. "You can get to miss horsing around. Even though you were playing, I reckon you're pretty good at this. You've got that accent down to a fine art, Jane. Maybe you should have gone for the role of the leading lady instead of one of the sisters." Jane felt her heartbeat pick up and her cheeks flushed just a little. She was, of course, remembering that the leading man kisses the leading lady in the closing moments of the play. She had read the part over and over again, secretly returning to her old girlish self every night before she turned down the oil lamp and went to sleep. Every night imagining herself in that very role, being kissed by her girlhood crush. "Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you," she said, careful to be grateful for the compliment he had given her. "To be honest, I hadn't wanted to audition at all. Eileen had signed me up for it and she just forgot to strike my name from the list when I told her I didn't want to do it. I'd only come that night to support her, you see, and ended up finding my way onto the stage somehow. It was kind of embarrassing, really," she said and saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. So, she had adequately explained her peculiar audition and she felt strangely relieved that she had. "Well, I reckon it's a good thing that Eileen is so forgetful," he began, interrupted only when Louisa Clayton flounced over and stood between them. I hardly think Jane is leading lady material, David, Louisa said with a high-pitched laugh. She barely managed to get a role as the angry sister. Did you not only achieve the role of sister yourself, Louisa? Jane said and laughed good-naturedly, despite the fact that, once again, she wanted to kick the young woman in the shins. All very corrupt, my dear. That Annie Baldwin has been getting leading roles for so long that Arlon Myers daren't upset her. If it hadn't been for that, I would be playing the leading lady, wouldn't I, David? Louisa turned simpering eyes upon the most handsome man in the barn. Of course she did. The sister roles are real good too, I reckon, David said, and Louisa positioned her body so that she could look at David and smile while slowly but surely turning her back upon Jane. I'm just glad to have a part myself, I don't really mind what it is, he finished with a shrug. I think you did very much better than the other men who auditioned for the role of lead. Yes, I think you're quite a natural, David, Louisa went on. Well, thank you, he said, and now Louisa's back was fully turned to Jane. She felt foolish for a moment, just standing there, a spare part in a conversation to which she was no longer invited. She didn't know if David saw anything at all to admire in Louisa Clayton, but she sure didn't want to stick around to find out. It was so strange that something so simple could undo all the good work she had done for herself that evening. It was as if it wound back her confidence, her few moments of laughter with her best friend Eileen, and the idea that she could talk to David and have it mean something to them both was just gone. Blown away like leaves on the wind. What was it with the Claytons? Why did they march right into the middle of everything and disrupt it, like peevish children kicking a hornet's nest? And now her old anger was swirling around her, meeting up with her lack of confidence and mingling in a tornado of negativity. She wanted to go home now, to be out of there, and wished that she hadn't given in to Garth's determination and simply stayed at home instead. Remembering her mother's poise, Jane looked around the room for somebody else to talk to, for somebody else's eye to catch so that she could extricate herself from the awkwardness without any hint that she was running away. Fortunately, Marianne, although still busy with Eileen, was looking at her quizzically and beckoned her over with a crooked finger. Thank goodness her dress wasn't yet finished. Chapter 10. As the two of them walked back to Eileen's house, Jane tried to regain her buoyant feeling of earlier in the evening. She tried to laugh and joke, but she was still smarting from what she saw as David's rejection of her in favor of Louisa Clayton. Are you sore over that Clayton creature? Eileen said, perceptive as ever. You saw that, did you? Yes, I was staring over while Marianne pinned up my hem. Seems like the Claytons always win. No, they don't, not always. For one thing, you and your family sure have shown them a thing or two these last couple of years, Eileen began, tapping the forefinger of one hand as if beginning to count off a list of things. And for another, Arlon Myers didn't give her the part she wanted. But that doesn't mean that David isn't impressed, Jane said sullenly. I don't think David is ever impressed by that kind of thing. Look at all the girls who flock around him at the barn dance. Precisely. What do you mean precisely? I'm trying to say that he never seems to pick up with any of them. But he never pushes them away either. He's not that kind of man. He's real polite, maybe a little too polite at times, but then he was always like that at school, wasn't he? Eileen turned to study her just as they reached the gate of her father's property. Shy and polite. Was he? Jane asked, and she wondered if she had really paid attention to him back then. Was it possible to form an infatuation without really getting to the bottom of a person, without knowing or noticing anything that was real about them? Please don't go dismissing him just yet, that's all I'm saying, Eileen said and kissed her cheek. Are you going to be all right heading back? Of course, I'll be there in no time. Jane collected her horse from the small paddock around the back of Eileen's house and climbed up into the saddle. It felt so strange now to ride a horse while wearing a dress, another thing which seemed almost irreparably changed about her. "I'll see you, Eileen," Jane said and blew a kiss down to her friend. "You ride safely," Eileen called back as Jane slowly sauntered away. She was still sauntering along when David caught up with her. She was heading towards the lane which would take her up to the ranch, enjoying not thinking about anything other than the sound of her horse's hooves slowly plodding along. "Jane," he called, and she stopped, turning to look at him. David was on foot and seemed a little out of breath. His home, she knew, was clear in the other direction from the one they were now both taking, and she wondered what he was doing there. "David? Is everything all right?" Jane asked, wondering if she ought to get down from her horse. "Fine, yes," David looked as if he wasn't sure what to say next. "I just wondered what had become of you. I was talking to you one minute and the next, you were gone." "Oh," Jane said and climbed down from her horse. It felt too odd to have a conversation when they were at such vastly different heights. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." He shrugged when she finally made level eye contact with him. "I suppose I thought I should leave you and Louisa to it, what with her turning her back on me and all. I'm not much for standing patiently to be humiliated is all." Jane felt a little stab of annoyance. Surely, it must have occurred to him at the time why it was she'd walked away. Surely, it must have occurred to him at the time that Louisa had successfully frozen her out of the conversation, and that he had done nothing to prevent it. What good was it chasing after her now? Was this just him being polite as Eileen had just claimed him to be? And was he just being polite, or did he actually care? "Oh, you mustn't mind her so much. She's just a little pushy," he said and chuckled. "Pushy she may be, David, but I still didn't want to stand there staring at my feet waiting to be included." "I guess I just don't carry on that way," Jane said and knew it was the truth, a truth she wasn't about to apologize for either. Why was everything getting to her so much of late? Why was her mood swinging so wildly from feeling deflated to feeling elated and back again? Perhaps it was the whole idea of getting back out into the world at the ripe old age of 21 that had turned her upside down to some degree. Whatever it was, she didn't like it. Maybe not much had changed in her world up on the ranch for the last couple of years, but her mood was always predictable. No highs, no lows, just as flat as the plains, and she was starting to think that that was how she liked it. "I just wanted to talk to you, really," he said and shrugged again. "Well, there was nothing stopping you," Jane sighed, feeling that every part of the conversation was wrong, that it was getting away from her somehow. "You've changed so much since school," David said, just about the worst thing he possibly could say at that moment. With Jane struggling to cope with her own lack of self-confidence and the strange newness of everything that ought to have been familiar to her, to have been reminded that she had been a far better person as a young girl at school was the last thing she needed to hear. "Well, I guess that's just life, David. I guess that's just the way things are for a woman who's been forced to work as hard as I have just to keep body and soul together. We can't all be like Louisa Clayton, pampered and silly, every hair in place, perfect skin without so much as a freckle, can we?" "Jane, I hadn't meant," David said, his eyes widening with surprise. But Jane suddenly felt as if she had swallowed poison and there was nothing she could do about it. The rawness she thought had slowly left in the time since her father had died was surprising her now by rearing its ugly head. But then Louisa Clayton doesn't get to rise before the sun comes up every morning and set off from the house in men's trousers and a shirt to spend all day herding cattle on horseback, mending fences, and trying to stop the barn roof from leaking, does she? She doesn't get to go to the barn dance once in a great while in a faded old dress, worrying that everybody's going to see just how rough her hands are and how straw-like her hair is from the sun. Jane was becoming breathless with every word. I didn't mean to upset you, Jane. And yet somehow you have. If you wanted to talk to me, David, you could talk to me. You chose not to, and I wandered away. It's as simple as that, isn't it? But no, you had to follow me and smooth things over when, let's be honest, there was nothing to smooth over in the first place, was there? I don't need to be reminded of everything that I'm not anymore, thank you. If you say so, he said and took a deep breath, looking back over his shoulder, perhaps wondering if he wouldn't be better off simply turning and walking in the direction of home. Well, good night, Jane. Good night, she said and sprang up onto her horse with ease before turning him sharply and riding away quickly. Chapter 11. As soon as she opened her eyes on Sunday morning, Jane knew she didn't want to go to church. She hadn't seen or heard anything of David since their awful parting at the bottom of the lane on the night of the rehearsals, and now she just felt foolish. She knew that David hadn't deserved to hear all that she had rained down on him. She was certain now that his comment that she'd changed hadn't meant to be the insult she'd taken it as. She also knew that she had vented everything she had been feeling, everything that had become a part of herself, and nothing that had anything to do with the conversation at hand. All her insecurities had come tumbling out, her faded dress, her rough hands, her rather masculine day-to-day occupation. Even at the time, she'd known that that was not what he meant when he'd said she changed. And he hadn't been wrong to say so, for Jane knew that she had changed. She wasn't bubbly and bright. She wasn't the young woman who stared wide-eyed into the future with excitement and expectation. She was a young woman who had been worn down by life and was, for reasons she couldn't quite fathom, somehow determined to stay right where she was. And everything she'd been feeling, every horrible, negative, low point in her soul, had come flying right out and landed on the only man in Grafton Crest she'd ever felt anything for. So, she was foolish on all counts. Of course, Jane knew that to stay away from church was the coward's way out. For everything that she had lost in the last few years, including aspects of herself, Jane had gained at least one thing: courage. If she didn't go to church, she would be losing just one more thing, and Jane knew that that would be more unbearable than anything else the day might bring. So, she was going to tough it out. She put on the same dress she always wore for church every Sunday and brushed her golden hair to a shine. She tied it back in a ponytail, securing it with a thin blue ribbon. If nothing else, her hair never let her down. Throughout breakfast and all the way to church, Jane had tried to give the impression, as she had been for the last couple of days, that there was nothing at all wrong. But her brightness felt forced, and she knew that her mother and Garth could probably see right through it. Heavens, even Joel, just 12 years old and with the attention span of a fruit fly, could probably see right through it. Still, nobody said a thing, all of them waiting for Jane to come to them in her own time. Elsie, her beloved sister, was such a wonderfully uncomplicated woman that it would hardly ever occur to her to interfere in her older sister's life. Jane had to admit, on this occasion, she would have welcomed a little sisterly intervention from Elsie. She would have welcomed the opportunity to secretly unburden herself, to admit her foolishness, to just one person. She hadn't seen Eileen for the rest of the week either, but that was certainly not uncommon. All in all, Jane had felt rather lonely in the last couple of days, and she knew, deep down, that she had caused that loneliness for herself. When the family walked into the church, Jane hurried along with her head down. They found a pew with enough seats for them all and settled down, Jane stoically keeping her eyes on her open hymn book somewhat prematurely, since the minister hadn't even begun his service yet. She just wanted something to concentrate on is all, something she would seem to be occupied by if David happened to look her way. As the minister began to speak, another thought struck Jane. What if David didn't care to look her way ever again? What if he was, even now, staring as fixedly at the minister as she was? What if he wanted nothing more to do with her, thinking her outburst something he couldn't quite forgive her for? And the thought stayed with her throughout the service. She had mumbled her way through the hymns, still staring anywhere but at the place David generally sat with his father. By the time they made their way out of the church, Jane was ready to run for home. If only Garth and her ma didn't find at least 2 minutes of conversation to be had with almost everybody who had attended church that morning. Of course, that was no different from the ordinary way of things. It just felt exacerbated by the fact that Jane wanted to be anywhere else on earth but there. So, when David himself finally approached her, she was already just about at her wits' end. He smiled reassuringly and all Jane could do was look back at him with wide eyes, openly surprised that he had sought her out. "I was just wondering, Jane, if you had to hurry back," he said, almost as much to Garth and Charlotte as to Jane herself. "No, she doesn't have to rush back for anything," Jane's mother chimed in with such speed that Jane began to blush violently. "Oh, Jane started. "I was just wondering if you wanted a little walk down by the river. We wouldn't be out long, I mean, you wouldn't miss your dinner," he said, and there it was again, that strange awkwardness, almost as if he expected to be turned down flat. But why would a man like David Clark, wealthy, educated, handsome, ever think that? Jane shook the thought off, certain that she must have it all wrong. The awkwardness was undoubtedly a result of the memory of her shocking behavior, and she wondered if the blush would ever leave her cheeks now. "Go on, off you go, the two of you. It's a nice day for it, it'll do you good, Jane," Garth said in a firm and fatherly tone, almost daring her to try to get out of it. "Thank you, David," she said, nodding at him before looking helplessly at Elsie. For her part, Elsie just looked amused, and Jane realized that her sister, so plain-spoken and uncomplicated, actually hadn't noticed that Jane had been out of sorts for days. Still, she was quick enough to see Jane flustered and enjoying the moment, and Jane made a mental note to find some sisterly way to get her back for that in the future. Without another word, the two of them set off, and Jane could feel the eyes of all her family boring into her back as they wandered away. Neither one of them spoke a word between the church and the river, and Jane wondered if he was searching hard for something to say in the same way that she was. In the end, they both spoke at once. "I'm sorry about," they both said in unison before David began to laugh. "Me first," he said. "I'm sorry about the other night, Jane. Not just the argument, but what came before it. I guess I'm just a little too polite sometimes, and I should have just ignored Louisa Clayton. Lord knows I can't abide the girl, I just find myself entertaining people I'd sooner dismiss. You know what, David, you really shouldn't have to apologize for being yourself. You shouldn't have to apologize for being polite, it's just not right. This is not your fault, it's mine," Jane said, already beginning to feel a little better when she realized that the courage that had been hard-earned over the last couple years had not deserted her entirely. "I'm always a little fragile and a little sensitive around any member of the Clayton family. I guess it's a long story, and I guess you probably already know enough of it to understand why. Everybody knows what Dale Clayton tried to do to your family. And I know none of us can ever prove it, but I reckon most of the town suspects that the pressure Clayton put on your father was the thing which chased him into an early grave. But you know what has struck me the most for some time?" "What?" "You stood up to them. Your whole family stood shoulder to shoulder at the worst time in your life, and you beat them. And as I hear it, as I believe it, you were right at the front and center of that. I know I'm kind of tongue-tied and clumsy at times. I sure do know how to say the wrong thing in the wrong moment, but while my tongue still seems to be working right, I want you to know how much I admire that. These last couple of years, just getting a glimpse of you now and again in church. I just wish that we'd been close friends at school, certainly close enough that I could have come right up to you and offered a few words of support. I don't know, maybe I've had things too easy, maybe that kind of courage comes harder to someone who hasn't needed to look for it much. Well, it seems to me that when you need it, it's there. It's certainly here right now, she said, and wished she had enough courage to reach for his hand as they walked along the riverbank. When I said you'd changed, I meant it in a good way. I realize now, of course, that I'd picked the wrong moment to say as much, he said and laughed. I have changed, David. I suppose I've changed for all the reasons I was barking about the other night. Although, I sure do wish I'd found a better way to let you get to know me. Because that's the thing, isn't it? We don't really know each other, she said, and, for the first time in a long time, Jane felt as if she fit perfectly inside her own skin. This ought to have been the most awkward conversation she'd ever had, a few brief words of apology before a hasty parting, and yet it was nothing of the sort. It was as if her unexpected rampage had brought them both to the same gate, one which they likely wouldn't have reached for weeks and weeks without her inappropriate explosion of emotions. I reckon I'd like to change that, Jane. I mean, I'd like to get to know you finally. His smile was slow and more confident, and his dark hair, lifting a little on the gentle warm breeze, made him look more handsome than ever. Could he really be saying this? After the events of the other evening, could he actually be interested in her? I'd like that too, she said, and imagined her young self, that bright girl in the schoolroom, fainting with happiness at this moment. What are you laughing at? David asked, squinting at her humorously. I just imagined myself as I used to be at school. I guess I'd always hoped for something like this. You mean with me? David asked, his eyes wide and his expression one of pure surprise. Yes, of course, with you. I mean, Barney Brown was always going to be taken, wasn't he? Jane chuckled mischievously, remembering again what it felt like to be that carefree girl, cheeky, amused, and amusing. Well, I sure can tell you now that it was a wonder that I learned anything at all back then. I used to spend most of the lessons trying to come up with ways to get nearer to you. Just thinking of things to say to you that would hold your interest for just a second. What? Are you serious? Jane asked, and it was her turn to be surprised. Well, this sure is a turn up. I wonder where we'd be now if I'd plucked up a little courage back then. I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't have gone so well given everything that's happened. I mean, I sure have neglected Eileen for all these years, and I guess I'd have done the same to you. That survival instinct and grief made me a little single-minded. So, maybe we should just start right where we are, David said, and finally took a gentle grip of her hand as they walked. Jane was thrilled. The old excitement of her youth had come flying back to her with full force, and she only hoped it wouldn't desert her again when she was alone. I reckon we should, she said almost under her breath. Just start where we are. I like that. Chapter 12. Jane climbed up onto her horse and began to slowly walk him back down towards the stable. She was finishing a little earlier than normal, it was true, but she knew how happy that made Garth. Everything he told her was right, they had enough help now and were doing just fine. Jane could take a little step back down again and think about her life, and the whole world wasn't going to fall apart around her. It was late summer, and the sun was beginning to make its way down in the sky. It was warm, but comfortably so now, and Jane thought it was just about her favorite time of year. She laughed as she made her way, wondering exactly what she had achieved out on the ranch that day. Perhaps exactly what she had achieved in the last couple of weeks, a very mediocre workload. She'd gone to every single rehearsal, even though she knew her tiny part word for word and had practiced every movement of it enough now that she would never need to do it again before opening night. But her reasons for going were almost everything but the play itself. She was rediscovering her old friendship with Eileen, not that it had ever really gone away. Perhaps it wasn't the friendship which had come back to her, but the old ease and the fun that had always been there in the past. Whatever it was, she was enjoying it immensely and, not only that, but she could see that Eileen was enjoying it too. At every rehearsal, the two friends insisted on dressing up entirely, even though it wasn't strictly necessary anymore. Better still, they amused themselves throughout by remaining humorously in character and conducting so many fun conversations, each of them in an exaggerated form of the part they were to play. It was like being at school again, with everybody around them enjoying the nonsense. Even Arlon Myers had chuckled once or twice, which was most unlike him. But perhaps not everybody was as impressed with Jane and Eileen, for Louisa Clayton was beginning to spend most of her downtime at the rehearsals tooting and muttering, registering her displeasure to anybody who would listen. And when the two of them had been rehearsing a scene between two of the three sisters, Louisa had very obviously tried to trip Jane on the stage, even though she had staunchly defended the whole thing as an accident. When David had raced to Jane's side and declared it to be anything but an accident, Jane couldn't help but be flushed with pleasure. She knew she shouldn't ought to, but she liked the fact that one of the Claytons was going to lose out again, despite her best efforts. Louisa had done a lot of primping and preening over the last weeks to no avail, finally realizing that David seemed only to have eyes for Jane. "The stable's over there, honey," her mother called out, a look of amusement on her face as she shook her head from side to side. "Or are you just going to ride the horse straight into the kitchen?" "Oh, my goodness," Jane said and drew the horse up to a halt, laughing. "I was somewhere else entirely." "Well, try to pull yourself together, because you have a visitor," Charlotte said, whispering with excited glee. "Eileen?" Jane asked, jumping down from the horse and lifting his reins over his head, leading him over to the stable. "No, David," Charlotte said, still whispering even though the two of them were now over at the stable and there was no chance whatsoever of anybody in the kitchen of the ranch house hearing them. "Oh, no." Suddenly, Jane felt as if she'd been turned upside down. She looked down at her trousers. The thick dark brown material was most unflattering and to some still a little scandalous. The tan-colored plaid shirt was only a little better, open at the neck with the sleeves rolled back to reveal her tanned forearms. Her hair was messy, just as it was at the end of every working day. Despite her broad-brimmed hat, whenever she took it off, what had been a neatly clipped bun underneath was generally entirely disarranged. Jane didn't know what to do first. She knew she had to get her horse's saddle off, brush him down, and set his oats and water down in front of him before putting him in the paddock. But she wanted more than anything to take off her hat and hurriedly do something to her hair, anything which would take the edge off her somewhat unfeminine appearance. "Do you want a hand?" Suddenly there was no time for anything, for Jane looked up to see David making his way out of the kitchen and walking towards them. "Oh, David," she said and smiled, wondering just how ridiculous she must look to him. "Here, I'll see to his saddle," he said and immediately began to unsaddle the horse. Charlotte, a knowing look in those motherly eyes, quietly absented herself, making her way back towards the ranch house without a sound. "You don't have to do that, David," she said, feeling awkward and a little unsure of herself for the first time in weeks. "Sorry, I wish I'd known you were coming. I would have got back a little earlier and been ready to meet you. I was just popping in is all, Jane." "You seem kind of upset," he said and raised his eyebrows. Not upset, just embarrassed, she said honestly. Embarrassed about what? David seemed to be genuinely confused. About this, she said and sighed as she spread her arms wide and looked down at herself. About what? He asked again, shaking his head. It's not exactly my Sunday best. Goodness knows, even my Sunday best is not my Sunday best anymore. I like your Sunday best, David said and gave her a mischievous grin. So did I, about 5 years ago. I liked it then too, he went on, and she wondered if he really meant all of this. Had he really not noticed how dreadful she looked? How work-worn and unsuitably dressed she was to greet a young man she had been courting for only a matter of weeks. Had he truly not noticed? Surely, if that was the case, it would make him a man in a million. To be honest, I think I'd hoped to avoid you ever seeing me dressed like a rancher, she said, honest again. This suits you, he said and looked her up and down with appreciation. If you mean that, David Clark, I reckon that might make you the strangest man in all of Grafton Crest. Why? He said at last. She watched as he pulled the saddle clear of the horse, placed the girth over the top, and took it into the stable. Carrying the heavy old thing with ease, he set it down on top of one of the low stall walls. It was a strange thing, but she had never imagined she'd ever see him do anything particularly manual. Perhaps she had more unexplored prejudices of her own than she'd ever realized. Well, most men probably wouldn't find their girl too attractive in men's trousers and a plaid shirt. I'm not most men, Jane. Not only that, you're not most women. You've always been beautiful, trousers aren't going to change that, believe me. And the hard work and the courage it takes to do something like this? Well, I reckon that only serves to make you more beautiful. So, if you've got no more objections to my presence than that, do you mind if I accept your ma's invitation to sit down and eat with you tonight? Jane found a girlish grin spread over her face. No objections at all. Then it's settled. Now then, is that bucket of oats for the horse? He asked, darting off back into the stable to retrieve her horse's well-earned meal. Chapter 13. Well, I reckon this must be the first Saturday you haven't worked for as long as I can remember. I know I've already said it 3 times, but I just can't believe you're here at my kitchen table on a Saturday with me making a pot of tea, Eileen said, so excited by something so simple. Not only that, but I had myself a good long soak in the tin bath this morning. Soaking and scrubbing, while everybody else was going about the business of work. Elsie had already eaten breakfast and gone, Garth was just finishing up his, and Ma was tidying everything away. I don't know, I guess it reminded me of how things used to feel back when Daddy was still around. A whole load of busy happening all around me while I lazed about doing pretty much whatever I wanted, Jane laughed self-deprecatingly. And to be honest, despite the fact that I enjoyed it more than anything, I don't think I'd ever go back to. Eileen raised her eyebrows as she took a seat opposite Jane at the small kitchen table. Go back to the person I used to be. What? You mean the person you've been trying to get back to these last couple of months? Don't you go confusing me now, Jane Meadows, you know how sudden changes upset my inner workings. Eileen began to laugh before saying in her finest housekeeper's character accent, I shall be quite undone if you do not behave yourself. Very good, Eileen. Very good. Jane gave a hearty round of applause as Eileen feigned her actor's bow without even getting up from her seat. Anyway, explain, Eileen said when the two of them had returned to being sensible. I suppose I've missed the parts of me that were more fun, Jane said with a quizzical expression. The parts of me which had so much confidence and the innocence to think that nothing ever went wrong in life. But apart from that, I'm not sure I want the rest back. We were always doing well, the Meadows Ranch, you know? Us kids never wanted for anything and we didn't have to do a great deal to earn it. When I look back on it now, it makes me wince. We hardly ever helped out around the house, although Ma didn't seem to mind too much. And as for Daddy, he just went out with Garth every morning and that was the last we saw of him. Not only that, but I reckon I didn't give much thought to what he did day in day out from the moment he strode out with a belly full of breakfast. I wonder if I'd have carried on like that forever. I don't think so, honey. Maybe it's just part and parcel of growing up, Eileen said, helpful and kind as always in her determination to let Jane off the hook. Or maybe I wasn't 1,000,000 miles away from being Louisa Clayton, Jane said and studied Eileen earnestly. Eileen didn't speak, she just burst out laughing. She continued to laugh until her eyes were watering and she was slapping the top of the wooden table with the palm of her hand. For goodness sake, Eileen spluttered when she could finally get her breath back. I've never heard the like. Well, perhaps not as mean-spirited as Louisa, but just the sort of young woman who takes everything for granted. Then we can all be like that, can't we? I take it for granted that my father is still a fit and strong man who is able to take care of my mother. The reason I take it for granted, honey, is because he's still here. If I'd suffered the loss that you had, I wouldn't be taking it for granted anymore. That's just how life works, Jane. Really, you just begin to come to life again and then you go finding some way to criticize yourself. Now you're not worrying over rough hands and tanned skin, you're wondering if you were good enough back then instead of good enough right now. I have an idea and I think it's a good one, she said and began to chuckle again. Why don't you just give yourself a break and listen to me when I tell you that you are a good person, you've always been a good person, and you always will be a good person. I can promise you now, honey, you would not be my best friend if it weren't the case. And as a discerning sort of a gal, I only want the best. I've got you and I've got Barney and I consider myself to have achieved my goal. I have the best. How is it that you can make me laugh at the same time as making me cry? Jane said, laughing gently as she wiped tears of emotion before they fell. Because I am a most exceptional friend indeed, my dear young woman, she said, back in character once again. Do you know you're wasted on the role of housekeeper, Eileen? I'll have a word with Arlon and have you elevated to leading lady. I'd let you if I thought Arlon would listen. Maybe next year, huh? Eileen grinned. Anyway, you hadn't finished telling me how things went when David turned up out of the blue and stayed for dinner. Well, after I got over the embarrassment of being caught out in men's clothes, it went well. Better than well, I'd say. I can't imagine Barney being the most complimentary if he found me in thick work trousers and a checked shirt, Eileen said, teasing. But to be serious, what a wonderful thing to hear. To look into his eyes and know that he meant it too, how romantic. I always knew he liked you, even back then. No, you did not, Eileen Thornton. All right, I didn't, but I should have done. You have no idea how much I've missed you these last couple of years, Jane said, surprising herself with her unexpected words. I'd almost forgotten how funny you are. Well, at least you came back to me in time and my obvious humor wasn't forgotten completely. Exactly. So, how was dinner? How did David manage with your folks? He can be kind of quiet and a bit awkward. Yes, he can, can't he? You always noticed that, and I never did. Perhaps I was too busy having a crush on him to bother myself to find out what sort of person he really was, or even to really notice it. Are we going to go back to you taking shots at your own personality again? No, Jane said and held up her hands in surrender. Anyway, he managed real well. You know what my ma is like, she could talk the back legs off a mule, so there weren't really any awkward silences. And then there was little Kathy, she couldn't take her eyes off him. Ah, she is such a sweetheart, Eileen said. She adored Jane's baby sister. I know she's more than 2 years old now, but she still has that adorable chubby baby look. She does, but she chatters away like a woman of 40. Granted, not all of it makes sense, but she doesn't let that stop her. She talked non-stop to David the whole time, even when he was in conversation with Ma or Garth. And then there was Joel, he's just not used to having another man at the table. He couldn't have been more impressed if he tried, and I suppose, because of it, he wanted to impress David even more. Ma couldn't stop him. He disappeared from the table, coming back with his fine collection of handcrafted catapults for inspection. It was pandemonium. It sounds wonderful, Eileen said and smiled dreamily. Actually, it was, Jane agreed. And it had been. She had never imagined she would feel so at her ease in such a circumstance. She'd always thought that the first time she had brought a beau home, she would be mortified and embarrassed. Instead, it was as if David had been pulled into the family, immediately accepted. Better still, he had seemed to like it. And so it was that she had lain awake for most of the night full of excitement, imagining what their lives together might be. She had never been so pleased to get up shattered the next morning. You two are quite the lovebirds, aren't you? Eileen said, still seemingly in a dream. Most of the time I think we are, yes. But? Eileen said and narrowed her dark eyes. But then other times I wonder if we're really only just friends. Just friends? Eileen said in a tone which suggested outrage at the comment. I don't know. From what I remember of romance and the barn dance and everything that went along with it, it never took too long before some man was trying to get a kiss. Goodness, I remember back then dancing with men who could hardly wait until the end of the dance before they tried to put their lips on you and you had to run for cover. Are you saying that David hasn't kissed you yet? That's exactly what I'm saying, Jane said and felt her cheeks going red. Really, I can't believe I'm a fully grown woman still worrying about such girlish concerns. It's times like this I'm reminded how far behind I am, how much I've missed out on. You haven't missed out on anything, it's just coming along a little later than it might have done. And honey, I envy you in some ways. Here you are turning yourself inside out worrying about the kiss you haven't had yet and making me mourn the loss of such excitement. I love Barney, I will always love Barney, but I guess it's kind of a shame that things like that often get a little commonplace, taken for granted. You're right, I guess I need to stop worrying about everything. And you're right to say that when I get over one thing, I seem to search for something else to concern me. Maybe I should just go with it, enjoy whatever comes whenever it comes, huh? Now that's more like it, Jane Meadows. That's more like it. Chapter 14. When David had called up at the ranch again, Jane had suffered none of her former embarrassment. Instead, she felt proud to stand there in the working clothes of a woman who had tried so hard and achieved so much. And, when he told her that he had come to invite her to his home for dinner on Friday, she had been full of excitement. For days afterward, she could think of little else. And that, unfortunately, was when the old feelings of doubt and insecurity began to creep back in. Why did she have to remind herself that she and her family had spent the last 2 years or so trying desperately to keep their heads above water? And why hadn't she made it her business to go down into Grafton Crest at some point before now and buy the prettiest fabric she could find? As things stood, she would either have to go to the Clark residence in her Sunday best or her well-worn and faded, not to mention plain, cornflower blue dress. And so, little by little, the hard-earned confidence of the last few weeks began to evaporate. Her mind was filled with images of the handsome but disapproving face of Mr. Peter Clark as he stared down at her, far from a perfect woman, who had set her heart on his son. His son, an educated junior attorney. And her, a ranch hand who wore men's clothes day in, day out. What father would want that for his only son? The truth was, she had never perceived any particular superiority in Grafton Crest's only attorney. Mr. Clark was a well-liked man who was quiet but always polite, much like his son. However, common sense was not going to have its way with her. Instead, her mind was going to torture her with images of everything that could possibly go wrong at a simple dinner at the home of the man she was beginning to fall in love with. When Friday came, the whole family was surprised when Jane announced she was going to take the entire day off work. She was a bundle of nerves, much to Elsie's amusement, and decided that she needed all day to get ready. Quite why, when she only had 4 half-decent dresses to choose from, was anybody's guess, but she didn't want to leave anything to chance. By the time she had to be leaving, Jane was already exhausted. She was scrubbed from head to foot, her hair pinned up nicely at the front and hanging in long, thick waves down her back, and her cornflower blue dress was without a crease anywhere. Garth had come back to the ranch house early, promising that he would drive her down into town in the wagon. However, by the time they reached the town, Jane knew that she was very, very early. "Garth, would you just drop me this side of town and I'll walk the rest of the way? I seem to be real early and I don't want to arrive at the house before David and Mr. Clark are even back from their office," she said a little ruefully. "I guess you're kind of nervous, huh?" he said gently, drawing the wagon over to the side of the wide main street through Grafton Crest. "You could say that," she said and sighed. "Oh, Garth, I feel like a little child." "I'll let you into a secret," Garth began as he gently took her hand. "We all feel like that sometimes. That's nerves, you see. Nerves can make any one of us, however old, feel like children. I suppose nerves remind you of you being a child. Of doing something new or different and not being sure how you're going to get on. But it will be worth it, I promise. David is a nice young man. Your ma likes him very much and you know she's never wrong," he said and chuckled. "It's not David I'm worried about, it's his father. But Peter Clark is a nice man, Jane. I can't think there's anything to worry about there. He's a nice man, it's true, but is he really going to want his only son to be settled with a woman like me? Like you?" "What do you mean?" "I'm just a ranch hand, Garth. I'm sure Mr. Clark has always imagined better for his son," she said and looked down. "You could never describe yourself as just anything, Jane. Wherever you are in this world, whoever you're talking to, you just remember that. The reason you are a ranch hand is because you had the strength to do it. The will to do it, and the determination to keep your family afloat. There's not many who can say they've done that, not as young as you were when you got started, that's for sure. That's not something to be ashamed of, Jane Meadows, it's something to be proud of." "Oh, Garth, you always say the right thing at the right time," she said, blinking quickly to dispel the little tears. "That's what I'm here for. You're like a daughter to me and you always will be," he said and leaned sideways to kiss the top of her head, careful not to ruffle her carefully prepared tresses. "Well, you're like a daddy to me, Garth," she said and sniffed loudly. "Now, let me out of this wagon before I burst into tears and ruin my outfit." She laughed and so did he. She waved Garth off as he turned the wagon to go and then turned to slowly make her way along the main street. The stores and businesses were all closing down for the evening and she supposed that David and his father were on their way home, if they weren't there already. Knowing that she had time to spare, Jane walked slowly, fighting hard to remember Garth's beautiful words instead of letting her mind do what it always did, throw her into a spin of negativity. She was doing well, until she spied, in the distance, father and son walking out of their office and locking up. It was a strange thing, but she'd never seen David dressed for work before. He always looked handsome and neat, but now he looked professional and so fancy she could hardly believe it. He wore a dark suit and a white shirt and even a waistcoat. He wore shoes instead of boots and his hair was immaculate. He was straight-backed and proud as he walked away along the street at his father's side, and Jane simply stood there for the longest time, unmoving as she watched them disappear. How much they stood out from the ordinary folk of Grafton Crest. How smart they looked walking casually along the street filled with merchants finishing for the day and ranch hands and farmers creeping along to the saloon bar for a well-earned drink. Jane didn't move for the longest time, not knowing how she could possibly keep going. How could she sit at their table in her faded old blue dress? How would Mr. Clark ever be able to accept her, a woman who wore thick trousers and shirts to work when his son looked so professional and immaculate? Trying to remember her courage, Jane kept putting one foot in front of the other until, after some 20 minutes, she found herself just yards from the Clark family house. It was a nice and tidy timber house, painted a pristine white as was the little fence which surrounded it and the grounds. In truth, neither the house nor the grounds were overly large, but they were certainly very fine, and she could see, around the side of the house, a man putting tools away in a pretty little shed. Goodness, they even had a gardener. This was certainly a world away from Wild Meadow and Jane felt deeply insecure. "I thought that was you," David said, smiling brightly and appearing seemingly from nowhere. "Oh, David," she said, as if to see him outside his own house was the very last thing she had expected. "Is everything all right?" he asked, clearly picking up on her awkwardness immediately. Fortunately, he had changed out of his fine work attire and was now wearing simple cotton trousers and a shirt. The shirt was blue and checked and suited him so well. It made his olive skin and bright blue eyes seem to stand out all the better, and she wished, for a moment, that he were not quite so handsome so that she might be able to focus her thoughts and concentrate a little better. "Yes. No. I don't know. Jane," he said and reached for her hand. "Just look at me, David," she said and decided, as always, that the truth would have to do. "This old dress, I'm not sure it's fit for your daddy's sitting room." "Of course it is." David was clearly dumbfounded. "Jane, you look beautiful. You always look beautiful. I might just as well have turned up here in my work clothes, hadn't I? But no, I'm wearing my old blue dress and hoping that it will distract your father from the truth of the fact that I'm just a woman who works on her family's ranch. I realize now that it wouldn't matter what I was wearing, even if I'd pulled myself together and bought some pretty fabric and had a brand new and beautiful dress made. I'm still me, aren't I? And you're still you." "I hope so," David said, smiling at her humorously as if trying to ease her nerves. "Oh, Jane, please don't do this to yourself. Don't make yourself feel awkward and different, it's such a horrible and destructive thing to do." "I should know," he finished, and Jane peered at him quizzically. "You?" she asked, sounding incredulous. "Different is different, Jane. It doesn't matter in what way. Look, when we were at school and all I wanted to do was talk to you, I was the different one. I was different from everybody there and I felt it every single day. I guess you'd find it hard to believe, perhaps you even think that because I came from this good home here and we certainly weren't struggling for every meal, that I had it easy. But all I wanted to be back then was the son of a farmer or a rancher or a merchant. I wanted to be exactly like everybody else around me so that I wasn't always on the edge of things. I was certain that if I could be just like all the other kids, I'd be confident too. I'd be noisy and carefree and fun. But I wasn't. I was just a quiet little boy who wasn't shunned exactly, but never felt entirely welcome either. I'd lost my ma and I was annoyed at my father for providing so well for me, if you can believe that, he said and gave a mirthless laugh. Oh, David, Jane said, her eyes filling with tears again. She had never imagined back then that David had felt so lost. Knowing the pain that she had felt on losing her father as a grown woman, she couldn't begin to imagine the dreadful hurt and grief that a little boy would feel, especially a little boy who was already different. She felt shabby then, almost selfish. Jane was, once again, allowing her own feelings and fears to take over everything, not imagining for a moment that other people could feel equally low. Eileen had told her more than once that David had been a shy boy in school, all the way through. But Jane had never seen anything beyond his handsome face and his thick dark hair. Jane had never bothered to get to know him properly, to find out anything about his family life or how he felt. She'd been a girl then, of course, but she was a woman now and she still hadn't asked him. All she'd done was bark at him when she felt insecure and tell him everything that she was thinking and feeling, never trying to discover anything which lay inside his heart unless it concerned how he felt about her. My father is a real nice man, Jane. Not only is he a real nice man, he sure is looking forward to getting to know you a little better. He likes your family, he admires everything you've all achieved just as I do. An achievement, Jane, can't always be seen in the clothes a person wears or the place they live. It's in what they've done. It's always in what they've done. He began to draw her towards the house, still holding her hand tightly. Come on, come in and say hello at least. In the end, Jane realized that all her fear and insecurity had been for nothing. Peter Clark was every bit as pleasant and polite as she knew him to be outside church every Sunday, and all the better for knowing, for he was also funny and interesting. Not only that, but he was interested in Jane too. When I was a boy, Jane, I always wanted to be a rancher. Well, a cowboy, to be honest. That's what all little boys want, I suppose, Peter said and chuckled as they sat around a large dark wood and well-polished table in the dining room. Even now, I feel a little envious, like I've missed out. It must be a wonderful thing, to wake up as the sun is rising and fill your lungs with fresh air. It does get a little stuffy sitting in an office all day, staring down at the desk and the papers and what have you, he continued. I like spring mornings the best, sir, Jane said, realizing that there was a great deal of truth in what he said. It's always cool and bracing in the beginning, but you know the sun is going to come out so brightly, but it won't be so hot that the working day is unbearable. As for evenings, late summer is my favorite time of year. She could hardly believe how easy she felt and how pleased she was to be talking about the things she did all day. Why so? Peter asked, his interest so genuine. Because the afternoons and evenings are just a little cooler than midsummer, but the sun is a beautiful orange, she said, closing her eyes for a moment and imagining herself riding her horse slowly back down to the ranch house after a long day of work. There are still such wonderful scents on the air, jasmine, sweetgrass, it's lovely, she said and realized that she actually did enjoy her work. The resistance she'd felt for so long had been against the idea of doing something she was certain she should never have been doing. Now she could see how it was that Eileen loved to work in the diner day in day out, never getting bored. It was accepting what you did and seeing the best in it, finding the joy in it, and that was where she had been going wrong. She knew the joy was there, she could recall it even now as she spoke to Peter, but she didn't honor it as she should have done. Her work was hard, but there was a wonderful freedom in it. She wasn't trapped indoors selling coffee or going through legal papers. She was out wandering God's beautiful earth with the fresh air in her lungs and the sun on her face. She could hardly believe that she was still feeling sorry for herself after so long. Your family have done so much to beat back the Claytons that I think you must all be very proud, Jane. I think we will be, sir, Jane said thoughtfully. It seems like only now that we are actually getting somewhere. For a very long time, it was like a battle. We were always trying to find ways around their efforts to turf us out of our own place, and it was exhausting, really. But we're almost up to full strength again, you know, in terms of the ranch hands we have employed. In the end, I don't think my family will continue to need me. But won't you miss it? Peter asked and seemed surprised that she could even think of leaving such a wonderful place. Yes, if I am really and truly honest, sir, I think I would, Jane said and smiled brightly at David's father. Chapter 15. When do you think you'll be getting married, Jane? Elsie asked the following morning as the two of them sat in the pale first light eating their breakfast. I only ask because it would be nice to have a bigger bedroom for a change. For goodness sake, Elsie, I only had dinner with David and his father last night. It's a little bit early to be talking about things like marriage, Jane said, but felt secretly thrilled by her sister's teasing conversation. And won't you miss me? Is that all I am to you? The opportunity for a bit more space? You always had the big room, and it's time I had the chance of it, Elsie said forcefully but began to chuckle. You would miss me though, wouldn't you? Jane said, squinting at her sister as she reached for another piece of bread. I don't know really. I mean, you're hardly ever out on the ranch these days, so I suppose we can cope without you. Elsie's flat delivery, to somebody who didn't know her, would have seemed quite serious. I know you'd miss me, Jane said, trying hard not to laugh. Wouldn't. Would. Wouldn't. Would. Girls. Charlotte said, turning from the stove to look at her daughters. Really, it's like you're still little sometimes. I wonder what Peter Clark would think now if he could see you, Jane Meadows. I suppose you're right, Jane grinned and shrugged. So, you really did have a nice time last night at the Clark house? Her mother asked for approximately the 17th time. As I said last night, Ma, it was lovely. Jane was certain that Garth would have discussed her little moment of self-doubt with her mother. That's what they did, they were a family. They cared about one another and worried about one another and wanted the best for each other. Jane felt like a new woman as she sat at the breakfast table, knowing that she had so much in life to be grateful for and wishing that she had seen it sooner. So, when's opening night? I can't wait to see you on stage in your fancy outfit with your fancy accent, Elsie said, changing the subject and amusing herself once again. As you very well know, it's next Saturday, Jane said and realized that she would miss going to rehearsals. In the last weeks, she'd had so much fun with Eileen and it had been a joy to watch David up on the stage, his voice so wonderful and the old Georgian outfit making him look even more handsome. They would find something else to do, some other activity that would bring as much joy to them as this had, she was sure of it. Jane had been returned to the world now and she was never going to turn her back on it again. She had Eileen, she had David, she had the very best. What are you going to do when Annie Baldwin kisses your beau, Jane? Elsie said and chuckled wickedly. Elsie. Behave yourself, their mother said sharply. It's all right, Ma, I know Elsie is just teasing me. And in any case, I won't mind at all. They're only acting, and Annie is a real nice girl. I must admit, I probably wouldn't feel so easy about it if Louisa Clayton had got the leading lady role. It's nice, for once, to see the town choosing not to give the Claytons everything they want. I know it's only a little thing, but I think it's important, Charlotte said, and Jane realized just how much the whole thing still had the capacity to hurt her. And yet Charlotte was dignified, even now, even in the comfort of her own home. Jane had so much to admire in those closest to her, and she knew it. But she had to admit, secretly, that she wasn't too sure that she really did feel so easy with the idea that Annie would get to kiss David before she did. She knew he was being a gentleman with her, polite even, but surely such things could be taken too far. At times her old insecurities came back and she wondered if he found her attractive, if he wanted them to be a couple, or if he was happy they were just friends. Anyway, enough talk of the Claytons already, her mother said, snapping out of it. We'll all be at the town barn rooting for you, Jane. I can't wait. Don't get too excited, Ma. I've only got a very small, very angry part, Jane said and grinned before turning her attention to her breakfast once more. Chapter 16. By the time Jane arrived at the town barn to get ready for opening night, the whole place seemed to be in some kind of uproar. She had plans to meet Eileen inside, having been driven down in the wagon by Garth and the rest of the family, all of whom were to take their dinner at the home of friends in town before the entire party made their way to the barn for the play. There were all sorts of hurried conversations going on, and, as Jane made her way into the barn further, she could see that Arlon was in the most dreadful state. He was pacing about in a most theatrical style as his poor sister, Marianne, trotted along by his side, patting him like she was placating a small and angry dog. How could this have happened? Oh, that girl, Arlon said as he continued to pace. Arlon, please. Annie Baldwin is a very nice woman and she's worked so hard at her part, you know she has. She cannot help it if she's fallen ill at the last minute, Marianne said in fervent defense of the leading lady. If she was going to get nervous at the last minute, she should never have auditioned, Arlon went on, refusing to be placated. It isn't nerves, Arlon. For goodness sake, Annie has a leading part almost every year. She loves the town play, and this isn't getting us anywhere, is it? Jane's eyes widened. She had no idea that Marianne Myers could be so forceful. It's time to stop pacing, Arlon, and start thinking. What's happening? Jane whispered into Eileen's ear the moment she found her. Oh, you're never going to believe it, Eileen said, looking bright-eyed and girlishly excited. Poor Annie has fallen ill and she's not going to be able to take the part of Clarissa Winchester tonight, Eileen finished, whispering. No. Jane said, deciding that she felt very badly for Arlon and all his hard work. Poor Arlon. And poor Annie. She's worked so hard and she's always so good. Oh, she must be devastated. They're going to need to find a new leading lady and fast, Eileen said, seeming to be enjoying herself in a rather inappropriate way. Half of the town is already on its way here, they can't cancel it now. What are they going to do? They can't go on without Annie. Yes, but she's not the only one who knows the lines, is she? Eileen said and gave Jane a look which unsettled her. Let's get a little bit closer to the front, Jane said, taking Eileen's hand. She could see David, already dressed in a tailcoat, waistcoat, knee breeches and stockings, every bit the English gentleman, watching poor Arlon with concern. He looked tall and handsome. A dark blue cravat was tied high around his neck, and Jane thought he could easily play the part of a royal prince. There's nothing else for it, we're going to have to call it off, Arlon said, more worked up than ever. I could be the leading lady, Louisa Clayton declared with confidence. Do you know all the lines, Louisa? Marianne looked at Louisa doubtfully. I know the story, Marianne. I don't need to know every single line. I will be able to carry it off with ease, believe me, she said flamboyantly, and Jane almost laughed when she saw Arlon wince. She could hardly imagine what he was going through now. Perhaps he already had a picture in his mind of Louisa up on the stage bellowing her lines to the audience and flapping her arms around, perhaps even pretending to faint for artistic effect. His masterpiece ruined by an arrogant, talentless young woman. Jane knows the lines, Eileen said, and Jane, hardly able to believe what she was hearing, turned to look sharply at her friend. She wished now that she had not admitted to Eileen that she had memorized every line and every move of the leading lady in her more lovelorn moments. She hadn't imagined for a moment that it was going to come back to haunt her like this. Really? Arlon looked at her with hope, as if he had just been thrown a rope in the midst of his own drowning. Well, Jane said, feeling herself blushing dreadfully. How on earth was she going to get out of this? That sounds like a good idea to me, David said, adding to the conversation for the first time. I think it will be easier for me to work with somebody who knows the lines rather than somebody who is making it up as she goes along, he finished, casting a look at Louisa. Well, if you want to stand up there with somebody as dowdy as Jane Meadows, more fool you. It doesn't matter if she knows all the lines, she isn't a natural actress. It'll just sound like she's standing up behind a desk in the schoolroom and reading from a book. Louisa's outburst was so childish and bitter that everybody present turned to look at her somewhat scornfully. Well, she's going to make the whole thing seem very stupid. I'll do it, Jane said, suddenly determined as she scowled at Louisa. Good, Arlon began, looking at Jane a little fearfully. Just promise me you won't do it in that angry style you used in your auditions, he said, and Jane realized that he had known at the time that her anger has been sparked by Louisa. No, I won't do that, Arlon. I'm not angry anymore, just amused, she said, and allowed her dignity to slip for long enough to give Louisa a self-satisfied smile. Oh, this is so exciting, Eileen whispered into her ear. Not for the first time, Eileen, you have managed to dump me into the center of this play. Jane said, giving her friend a humorous scowl. I know, I'm getting good at this. Right, everybody get moving. Marianne, help Jane into the dress you made for Annie, Arlon began, peering at Jane for a moment. Good, they're about the same size, he muttered to himself and then looked all about the room. We need a new Henrietta Ravenswood to take Jane's place, Marianne said, looking at the gathered players. Janet Morton, who had hitherto been cast in the role of a non-speaking maid, was only too keen. So, the show really would go on. Suddenly, Jane realized what this meant. Her first kiss with David would be on stage in front of the watchful and spiteful eye of Louisa Clayton. Chapter 17. There was a great deal of panic and rushing around, getting everybody dressed and having the stage ready in time for the curtain to open. However, everybody worked together, and Jane could hardly believe that they were ready with 10 minutes to spare. You're going to be great, I know you are, David said, whispering into her ear at the back of the stage. I suppose a good thing is that I haven't had time to let my nerves get the better of me, she said honestly. How glad she was now that she had rehearsed every single line. How ridiculous it all seemed that she was now going to be the leading lady in a play she hadn't wanted to take part in the first place. But that was life, and Jane was learning to embrace it. When the curtain went up, Jane only looked briefly at her family and smiled, knowing that if she gave them too much more attention, her nerves would begin to trouble her. They would realize soon enough that she had been catapulted into the role of leading lady, and she didn't want to see their surprise when that realization dawned. Instead, she kept her eyes on the stage and everyone on it, determined to get through this. Once again, her anger at Louisa Clayton had propelled her forward, but this time she wouldn't let it be her undoing. It would fire her performance and determination. She would do as good a job as she could possibly do and hope for the best. And she would also be careful of Louisa's feet, not wanting to give her an opportunity to trip her over. All in all, the play was going very well indeed. Eileen stole the show with her comical performance of the housekeeper, just as Jane had always known she would. For herself, Jane had remembered every line and every movement perfectly, feeling more and more confident as each moment passed. It was only towards the end of the play when she began to feel a little nervous, knowing that David was soon going to kiss her. Not only kiss her, but kiss her in front of the whole town. She hoped that he was going to be happy with it all. The kiss had never been practiced in rehearsals, to spare the leading actors any embarrassment. Arlon said it would be better done first on the night, so that the newness of it all would be entirely believable. Jane felt like $1 million in the beautiful Regency gown that Marianne Myers had made. It fit her perfectly, after an extra stitch or two in the sides, and she could hardly believe that she was the same woman who charged about planes on horseback day in day out. "I do not know how much longer I can go on like this, Mr. Ravenswood," Jane said as the play was drawing to its last moments. "I know it is not the done thing, sir, but my feelings are such that I cannot, in truth, hold on to them a moment longer. I would give anything to hear such words from you, Miss Winchester," David said, looking directly into her eyes and making her feel a little warm and nervous. "How long I have dreamed of you, my dear. How long I have yearned for you. Then I shall speak plainly, sir, since you do not seem to have an aversion to such things." Jane's accent was absolutely perfect. "I shall speak plainly and tell you that I have been truly in love with you for as long as I can remember. I cannot imagine my life without you. And I cannot imagine my life without you, Miss Winchester." "Camilla." "Oh, Mr. Ravenswood, I could cry. I have never felt like this in all my life." Jane's heart was beating fast. She knew the kiss was coming. "I love you, Camilla. I know I have been distant, I know I have not always been so obvious in my affections, but I have felt them, nonetheless. I have felt them deeply, relentlessly, and they have never let me go once since first they began." He took several steps towards her and Jane could hardly catch her breath. "I hardly sleep for thoughts of you, my dear, night after night. You fill my waking thoughts, you steal my sleep, you haunt my dreams." His words seemed so intense, so real, and she realized then that he truly meant them. He wasn't Aloysius Ravenswood, he was David Clark. He reached out to take her hands in his and drew her towards him. "In all of my own dreams, sir, I could never have truly believed this day would ever come. These words, these beautiful words, had I dreamed them, I would not have believed them." "Oh, Mr. Ravenswood," Jane laid her head on his chest. "Aloysius," she breathed the word, and there was absolute silence in the barn, as if the audience were all holding their breath. Finally, David slid a finger beneath her chin and tilted her head to look up at him. With his blue eyes fixed on hers, he leaned forward and kissed her. Despite the fact that it was, as written, a very chaste kiss fit for an English drawing room, it felt wonderful to her. He kept his lips on hers for a long time, seeming disappointed when he finally had to release her. The audience was making murmurs of appreciation, little sighs as the romance of Arlon Myers' play finally touched their hearts. And then David leaned forward again, quite unexpectedly. He took her face in his hands and kissed her once more. He kissed her with more passion this time, and there was a collective "ooh" from the audience. This was an unscripted kiss, something that nobody, not even Jane, had been expecting. When he finally let her go, he smiled at her broadly. "Sorry, I couldn't help it," he whispered into her ear, before taking her hand and turning them both to face the audience. "I have wanted to do that for so long." Thrilled with the romance of what they had just seen, the little slice of passion that they hadn't been expecting, the audience was already on their feet clapping loudly, some of them even stamping their approval. In no time at all, the remainder of the cast came out onto the stage and the entire group of players stood in a line, holding hands, ready to take their final bow. And, just as they raised their arms into the air, Jane looked down into the audience. There, with a scarf around her head and a furtive look, was none other than Annie Baldwin. She tried to disguise herself, but Jane knew it was her. As the line of actors swept down into their bow, Jane couldn't take her eyes off Annie. In the end, Annie just winked at her before hurrying away out of the room, clearly not wanting anybody to know that the real leading lady had been secretly watching the whole thing, not at home in her sickbed. Jane looked down the line of actors until she found Eileen. She was beaming brightly as she met Jane's eye, knowing that Jane had realized at that moment that Eileen and Annie had worked it all out between them. Annie had foregone her yearly role as leading lady so that a somewhat insecure young woman could have the first kiss that she had been worrying about for so long. What a wonderful, beautiful, amazing place Grafton Crest really was. "I love you, Jane," David whispered into her ear as the line of actors still stood on the stage, hand in hand, enjoying the appreciation of the audience. "For so long it has been a love from afar. At last I'm strong enough to admit it." "I love you too," Jane whispered back, realizing that this was just about the best night of her life. Gently, she squeezed his hand before leaning back to his ear. "You have made me so happy," she whispered against his ear. Epilogue. 8 months later. "Don't you miss it, though?" Elsie asked, sitting at the large dark wood dining table in Peter Clark's house. "You know, getting up with the Larks, flinging yourself up into the saddle, munching your way through Ma's giant food parcels out there on the ranch?" Eileen, who had joined them for this dinner, winked at Jane. "I do, but not enough to come home. I'm a married woman now, Elsie, and you can rest assured that the big bedroom is still yours." Jane grinned, and all present laughed. Peter seemed to laugh harder than any of them. He seemed to understand Elsie and her humor without any explanation whatsoever. Moreover, he seemed to have been brought out of his shell a little by inheriting Garth and Charlotte Martin and all the Meadows offspring as a new family. He invited them over with such regularity that Jane realized he looked forward to her family's visit as much as she did. He often included Eileen and Barney in the gatherings, knowing how much Jane appreciated it. "Jane's got her own life now, Elsie," Garth said and chuckled. "She got us to where we are, honey, and we can manage without her now." "Oh, I don't think I like the phrasing of that much." Jane laughed and reached across the table to playfully swat Garth's arm. "You know what I mean, you have a new life and new responsibilities now." "Yes, and those responsibilities are going to change again very soon," Jane said cryptically. She turned to look at David, raising her eyebrows as if in question. They had decided to tell their respective families all together, to have them gathered in one place to hear their wonderful news all at once. Of course, she had included Eileen in that family, as without her she doubted that this moment would have happened. It was hard not to catch her friend's eye, and she heard Eileen give a little gasp of delight that was quickly muffled. Jane and David had been married for just 6 months and, when Jane had realized that she was with child, she had been so excited that she almost couldn't speak. In the moments before she'd told her darling husband that he was to be a father, she had remembered that first evening at the town barn dance. Her faded cornflower blue dress, that terrible feeling that everybody had moved on in life and had left her behind. At that moment, she'd realized that she'd never been left behind. This was just life, and things happened when they happened and were no less wonderful for their timing. If she'd had to wait until she was 30 for such happiness, Jane had known there and then that it would have been worth the wait. "Go on, my love, you do it," David said, reaching out to lay his hand over hers. "Well, we have some very good news for you all," Jane began, enjoying dragging the whole thing out a little bit. "You can probably already guess what it is." Eileen squealed and a murmur ran around the table. "We can, but we want to hear it from you," Garth said, smiling so wide he was hardly recognizable. "David and I are expecting our first child. Around about springtime, I think," she said and smiled at them all, enjoying their surprise and delight. "Your favorite time of year, my dear," Peter said, nodding at her, his eyes shining with tears that she knew he would manage to manfully hold back. "My favorite time of year," she said and turned to look at David. His dark hair and blue eyes seemed to grow more beautiful by the day, and she could hardly believe that the boy she'd had such a crush on so many years before was going to be the father of her child. They would be together forever, and they would be happy, she knew that. "Honey, congratulations. Both of you, really, I hardly know what to," was all that Charlotte Martin managed to say before her voice wobbled and deserted her completely and she was forced to pull a handkerchief from her sleeve and dab at her streaming eyes. "Thank you, Ma," Jane said, her own tears falling now, even as she laughed a little. "I'm so proud of you," David said, whispering to her as all present began to babble excitedly. Joel was excited that he, at the tender age of 13, was going to be an uncle. Elsie was hoping that it would be a girl, so that they would have a proficient spare ranch hand if needed. Little Kathy, not really understanding what was going on, simply squealed with delight and clapped her chubby hands, enjoying the moment in the way that small children do. "And I'm proud of you too, David. I love you so much. All these years I've loved you, and finally I'm the happiest man in the world," he said, still whispering, but it was clear that everybody had heard him when Charlotte Martin wailed her appreciation of his romantic words. "We're proud of you both," Garth said, manfully battling his own emotions. "And I know I can speak for your daddy when I say that he would be so proud of you too." "Thank you, Garth. All of you, really, thank you. My life is so complete and so happy, and it couldn't possibly be that way without every single one of you in my life. My wonderful husband, my wonderful family, and my interfering friend who is part of this family," she said and raised her glass in a toast, smiling as all present did the same. "To family. To family," they all chorused. Thank you for listening to this Indiana Wake audiobook. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to Indiana Wake and Friends so you never miss future free audiobooks and new adventures.